Part 3, The Indian Motorcycle Clothing Brand. Chapter 83. I decided that I was going to create 4 t-shirts and create a hang tag using the aforementioned copy that Stuart Sawai had written. I used better quality tees to print on, sewed my Indian motorcycle winged headdress crest on a small bag that was really cool. Then the first thing I did was go see Gerald. I said, "Danius, do you want to do this project with me?" He wasn't interested. However, he wanted to help me any way he could. It was time I hit the road to visit a few stores that I knew carried lines that Indian Motorcycle would go well with. However, things didn't go quite as I had planned. The people I saw loved the shirts, but they said that I needed a whole line. I needed to be able to create different collections for different seasons. These weren't my friends that would just put a few things on the shelves and racks in their stores. I also realized that Indian Motorcycle had to be in stores everywhere, as I believed it had a mass appeal. While the brand was now growing in a positive direction, I continued working on projects at Amazing Graphics. I was still wheeling and dealing and still going out to see live music. My life continued as usual, but now I had this greater purpose. I was always keeping my positive vibes flowing and never let myself stay in a negative mood. I truly believed that would only cause problems in many different ways in my mind and body. Believe in yourself. Always be keel. Another 2 of my aphorisms were never give up and always follow through. I'd sit back and boast something that was always high quality, and that's when I had an epiphany. High quality. I needed someone who had distribution all over Canada and carried high quality lines of clothing and accessories. I knew of an agency as one of the owners was married to a girl I had gone out with way back when. I somehow scheduled a meeting. I met with them and they were very interested. It was probably in May of 1991. The deal I made was to give them each 25% and I would own 50%. None of us would take a salary and we'd see how it would go. I brought all the shirts I printed to their office, located on King Street. There may have been 250 tees. They had 2 floors. Offices and showrooms were on the first floor, stock and shipping in the basement. As soon as their customers saw the Indian Motorcycle tees, they started grabbing them right out of the box. It was happening, man. Everything I thought it would be. People loved the product. Chapter 84. I had to act fast as we were introduced to my first real supplier that my partners had already been using for some small productions they had done. It was the Incredible Clothing Company, owned by Abe Glowinski. I met him and he seemed like a great guy. He set me up with one of his salesmen, Avi Weiner, and we were off to the races. I started to create labels with a company called Laven Industries and dealt with Lee McLaven. It was a family-owned business and I used them for hundreds of different labels. Lee and I are still friends, and if I ever need a label, I know where to go. I still had my office as I didn't want to do anything too rash or get too ahead of myself with this passion project. I'd always said to myself, be keel, Fuss, always be keel. It was very exciting to finally be able to let loose and start expanding Indian Motorcycle. I went to see Gerald and went through everything I could possibly find and left with many brochures and other classic materials. I'd scan through page by page and mark all ads, brochures, and catalogs, anything that I thought was graphically cool pertaining to Indian Motorcycle. I was soaking up as much inspiration as possible. I would make copies right away so I could return the memorabilia as fast as possible. While executing this process, I was also learning a lot more about Indian Motorcycle. I also realized that in early Indian days, the company would use the spelling motorcycle, dropping the R. This was done simply to avoid any possible legal actions arising from patent suits, which had been a continuing problem within both the motorcycle and automobile industries since the earliest days of organized manufacture. I started showing just how fussy I was. At Incredible T, I would always be with the actual screen printer in the back. I knew I might want to make color changes or placement changes on the designs. This was unusual, as most clients would get a sample and be called when it was ready. Not me. I was right there when it came out of the actual printing press. I was very hands-on. If it were caps, I would approve and sample after it was done. I liked old vintage style caps and used a company called Harris Cap, owned by Marvin Harris. He was an interesting fellow, to say the least. His company had been in business for many years and he did things the old school way. They had great low style caps. I was trying to keep the vintage look with all the Indian products so that it fit nicely with my vision at the time. I'd seen an Indian motorcycle biker jacket by Lee Trevor in the store called Fab, which was on Queen Street beside the Bamboo. Lee Trevor was a company in France that made unbelievable vintage leather jackets. They were distressed and looked like they were old and worked in. I had to tell Peter, the owner, that he couldn't sell the Indian motorcycle style anymore, as I had the trademark for Canada. He willingly stopped. I knew another retailer that was also on Queen Street, just west of Fab, that was selling knockoff Lee Trevor Indian motorcycle jackets. It was a strange coincidence, as it was called Due West. I went into Due West and met George and his father. They were Greek and actually manufactured leather clothing in the back half of the store. I told them I own Indian motorcycle trademark. However, maybe you can produce the jackets for me. They made 2 sample jackets. I think a single jacket weighed almost 20 pounds. It was crazy. Plus, they wanted too much money for a jacket. I explained that I was a wholesaler, but they didn't care. I told his father, you can't sell Indian motorcycle jackets. His father said, oh, threats. I've heard them before. I said, okay, you'll see when I stop you. When I was in his store, I realized that he was knocking off all the brand names. They were bootlegging everything from Replay to Diesel. They would get the crest and patches made and would produce very high quality copies that they could sell way cheaper than the originals. I still needed to find someone to make the jackets I wanted. I found another supplier in Vancouver called Cymax. They made a perfect sample of the biker jacket for the perfect price. I had the crest made at a company called Chenille Crest, which I then dyed using tea so they looked just like the Lee Trevor jackets. It was located on Adelaide, west of Peter Street. Everything was in the garment district, which was my stomping grounds. The owner's name was Herb Moore. Everyone called him Herbie. He was a fantastic elderly guy and one of the only people left with the old-style machines making the real chenille. We did a huge amount of business together, and he was like an old uncle to me. We'd talk about different ways to take advantage of the real chenille and the capabilities of his vintage machines. He eventually sold the business and moved north of the city. I did invite him to one of the opening parties in 1999, and he came with his wife, but I lost touch after that. I wish that I hadn't, but that's life. Chapter 85. The first year we did $250,000 in sales. We were really hot, and I had to think about what I was doing with Amazing Graphics. It wasn't that hard of a decision. It was time to say goodbye and move on to the next chapter of my professional life. Sharon had had enough, and she really just enjoyed drawing portraits and paintings for people. So I moved into the basement of the agency on King Street. I didn't want to be doing my creative thing on the second floor. I was way more comfortable downstairs being low-key. This way I could work in private and I could see all the customers come in and try the products on. I took the stat camera from the old office and created a stat room there, which acted as a change room if someone needed privacy. Although most of the customers didn't care if they changed out in the open, and neither did I. When we finished the first year, I asked my father if he could come and set up things so I knew I wasn't getting ripped off. I can still see him in his kitchen at Heath Street apartment. It's something I will never forget. He was screaming at me saying, "You're doing $250,000 in sales. I'm not going in there." He was red in the face and spit was coming out of his mouth. I couldn't believe it, man. I left and was kind of freaked out at what had just happened. I thought he would want to do it as he was an accountant. I shook it off, as I always did, and just kept my positive vibes flowing. Chapter 86, The Counterfeiters. Along with Due West and all kinds of stores on Yonge Street, we had gotten word that a company that was carrying the Replay jeans line was about to receive a shipment of Indian motorcycle clothing from the U.S., and it was time for us to act. One of my good friends, Mitchell Itchke Dubras, was a private investigator. I told him what was happening, and he turned me on to a group of ex-policemen who took care of stuff like this. You had to get an Anton Pillar order. This is a court order that provides the right to search premises and seize evidence without prior warning. This is exactly what they did over and over. I learned that plagiarism is the biggest form of flattery. If people aren't copying you, then your stuff is no good. We stopped the Replay jeans boys, and I was surprised to see that the Indian brand was still called Indian Motorcycle, and I would find out why soon enough. We stopped Due West and also confiscated a lot more knockoffs from all kinds of places. I would see George's father in court, even though I was in the right. I apologized to him. Respect your elders, man. Chapter 87. I was now learning that your trademark was only as strong as long as you protected it. This is where my old school president from Forest Hill Collegiate would come into play. His name was Joe, and he worked at a big law firm that specialized in trademark law. I reached out to him on the side and visited him at his home as he lived close by. I had to kiss his ass and bring him bagels and fresh squeezed OJ in the mornings, but he finally came on board. He accomplished what was needed, and we paid his firm for his services. It was all part and parcel. I had purchased these great belts in Western Corral and found out who the manufacturer was and went to meet him. His name was John Brown, and his company, Johnny B. Goods, was located around Bathurst and Queen. He had a small studio there where he made everything. I started making belts with them. They produced everything right on site, and you could discuss and try different ways to make your new styles and products. We sold thousands of belts and keychains, and the product was extremely durable and could last a lifetime. I still have many and often receive compliments on them. At Century Products, out of Montreal, I created many different Indian motorcycle grommets to adorn the belts and keychains. Each item was a piece of art. Working with Century Products would become huge for me, as I would create so many items with them, from grommets, belt buckles, and keychains to zipper pulls, snaps, and all sorts of trims. I dealt with their Toronto rep, a woman named Madeline. She was great to work with, and I'm sure when she first met me, she never would have imagined how much business I would be doing. It was thousands and thousands of pieces, but she always made it happen. My parents had moved cottages once again. This time we were a couple points more north. The place had a small, shallow beach and was sandy, so it was perfect for the kids, and I could pull them on skis in the shallow water. Chapter 88. In the second year of Indian Motorcycle, we decided we would pay rent and I would make a salary. Our sales had doubled, and I had been getting hints from some of the girls working in the office that something fishy was going on with the house sales, and I finally couldn't take it anymore. I went to my father to ask him to come down and have a meeting to make sure all was cool. Once again, he said no, except this time I said, "You're fucking coming with me, because they are screwing around with the house sales, and I'm not going to know what they're talking about." He begrudgingly came, and I met with my partner, who was more involved in the sales. Let's call him Sly Man. We met him in his office, and my father and me were sitting across from him. My father pulled out his green paper with the columns on it. This is what he used to keep records of accounting, him being old school. He had been doing some work for us from the tax returns we filed. About 10 minutes into the meeting, my father asked, "Where are the house sales recorded?" The Sly Man answered, "Oh, they're all accounted for." I couldn't believe it, man, lying right to our faces. My dad says, "No, they're not." "Oh, I guess we can't do that anymore," the Sly Man uttered. I was so stunned. I said, "Well, Indian is not paying rent for the next 3 months. We paid $6,000 a month." When he said no problem so quickly, I realized I should have said Indian is not paying rent for a year. Who knows how much money in-house sales they had taken. This was how they did it. When anyone from pro athletes to famous rock stars or film stars came in and bought product, whether it was Indian Motorcycle or Big Star jeans or any other lines they carried, and wanted to pay with a credit card, it went right into their bank account. Who knows how much money they had taken in those first 2 years. My sister had her third child, January 30th, 1992. She named her Jacqueline. I called her Jacquelinsky, and now there were 3. I thought, the more the merrier, and better to play with. Chapter 89. I took a vacation to visit a friend that lived in Fort Lauderdale. On the way back, I was sitting in my seat, listening to my tunes, when a stewardess came up and shook my shoulder. She said, "You need to report to the cockpit." I was seriously freaking out. I had no idea what was happening. When I reached the cockpit and they opened the door, they were waving an envelope with a bow, and the stewardesses were waving and clapping. Apparently, I'd won 2 tickets anywhere in the world that Air Canada flew. I went from being freaked out to very happy. Being a good son, I gave them to my parents. They used them and went to Switzerland. This was the first big thing and one of many things I would do for them. Not that they remembered later on, but that wasn't the point. Being a good son was. Chapter 90. Alan Kemp is the one key person in my life when it came to designing clothing. He came to Toronto from Winnipeg and was working at a company called Galaxy Garments, and his specialty was denim. He was a friend of Joel Carmen, who owned a store in Yorkville called Over the Rainbow, which was a huge customer of Montana River. My partner, the Ego Man, introduced us, and we quickly became great friends. I started calling him the Kemper, and he was creating Indian Motorcycle jeans and shirts for us. We were using Japanese denim, heavyweight for jeans and lightweight for shirts. We also use lightweight Tencel denim. The beauty of Indigo Tencel is that it's a revolutionary product derived from wood pulp, unlike its cousin rayon. It's able to withstand heavy abrasion, and the result is a buttery soft, silk-like feel. I would work on all the details, like hang tags, back belt patches, buttons, etc. Labeling was key, and I used a label company called Laven, who I would use forever. I struck up a friendship with one of the sons whose name was Lee. I called him Lee from Laven. I used taglines from Indian motorcycle memorabilia. For example, there's magic in these jeans, a model for every type of rider. And of course, my favorite, wear a piece of American history. The jeans were a big hit, and the agency was the perfect starting point. While working with the Kemper, I learned a lot about indigo, being both antimicrobial and antioxidant. This is the reason you don't have to wash your jeans for a year or even longer unless you spill something on them. Chapter 91. I met a young employee of the agency who was a Bosher, and he turned me on to a Jamaican dude who supposedly had some great Jamaican hash, which was called Jamaican gum. I did a deal with the dude, and it looked great. However, looks could be deceiving, as I should have known, and just like that, I was burned once again. I didn't even get buzzed. Once again, after such a long time, I was ripped off. Always try the product unless you really trust the seller and are experienced. Usually, after you got ripped off, you would never redeem the loss, especially from the person who ripped you off. However, the wildest thing happened around 10 months later. I got a call from the Jamaican dude telling me he wanted to meet. I did, and to my surprise, he replaced the bad shit with twice as much amazing real Jamaican gum, and we would see each other for the next few years before I retired from wheeling and dealing and gave my connection to a friend. Chapter 92. I was still hooping away. Besides playing in organized leagues, I had a pickup game at Lawrence Park Collegiate. It was a lot of fun playing with good old friends like Teeners, Gotch, Stitch, and Morley. We had a lot of younger guys in the game too, like Adam Albright, one of Kenny's younger brothers. One person in particular was Michael Lumpy Brickman, who eventually became one of my many chiropractors. I even took the young kid who turned me on to the Jamaican gum dude. His name was Keith, and he was a white kid who wasn't that good, but man, he could really leap. He had some serious hops, especially for a white dude. The pickup game was going great until I got injured again. I had jammed my finger, a common injury in hoops where the ball hits the tip of your finger. Instead of putting it in a splint, I kept bending it, thinking I was doing the right thing. However, after a week, I couldn't bend my finger at all. My doctor, Sharon's husband, sent me to a specialist. It was a woman, and she told me that I would have to get a plastic joint put in. Otherwise, I would never be able to make a fist. I asked her, will I still be able to play basketball? Definitely not, she said. Sharon suggested I see her sister, Iris, who was an occupational therapist. Iris told me to do some stretching exercises with my finger, pulling it out and bending it. She also made me a special sized elastic band that I could wrap around my finger to keep it touching my palm. That would also help with bending it. In the end, I was able to make a fist and play basketball. Once again, I realized that getting a second opinion when injured severely enough is always a must. Chapter 93. There was something happening that I was watching very carefully. Indian motorcycle bodies/styles were being duplicated for one of the agency's brands. I didn't mind a few, but after the Ego Man went to LA with the Kemper, who was freelancing for Indian Motorcycle, meaning the trip was on Indian's dime, I wasn't cool with that. They took the bodies they found and used them for Big Star 2. What started as a few soon came to be 20 bodies. That was concerning to me, as Indian Motorcycle was becoming very popular and a lot of celebs were buying it. This was when I started to notice the Ego Man becoming very jealous of all the attention it was getting. My friend Randy Angel Young's family owned a clothing manufacturing company called Uniforms Registered. Their office used to be on King Street. Randy was in Toronto after coming back from Asia and was doing some contracting for a company. I had a meeting with him, and he did the first production of a men's quilted nylon vest, which I then had different patches sewed onto the left breast. He had the fabric quilted by a company on King Street called Double Text. The vests were a huge hit, and he did the contracting for a few production runs. Then he moved to Sri Lanka to work for Stafford Textiles and oversee production for Nike, Champion, Fila, and all the top sportswear brands. One of the first pieces of clothing that Kemper and I did together was when he created the pattern for a cool quilted women's nylon vest. We had some samples made, which I again had different crests sewn onto the left breast and used an arrow zipper pull. This was one of the zipper pulls I had developed earlier when we did the half-zip long-sleeve thermal top with Incredible Clothing Company. It too was a huge success and was the beginning of our women's line of Indian motorcycle outerwear. Gerald and Lilish got married April 5th, 1992. Another close friend takes the plunge. Chapter 94. There were many things going on in the U.S. with Indian Motorcycle. From the time I had stopped the Replay Reps and their Indian Motorcycle brand, a magazine called Indian Motorcycle Illustrated was published in the spring of '93. It was very informative about the history of Indian motorcycles and goings-on in the U.S. There were a lot of ads for products, including the Indian Motorcycle line of clothing and accessories, which I had confiscated. In the spring of 1993, the first issue had an article about the history of the trademark. These are just some of the key points taken from this article. The Indian trademark saga. They interviewed Bob Stark, owner of Stark Lake Cycle, who's been working on Indians since 1956, and whose father was an Indian dealer from 1918 through 1952. He believes the trademark lies within the public domain. He continues to say, the legality of the trademark breaks down after 1953. There was no legal transfer to the trademark that anyone can discern. Stark picks up the story with one Floyd Clymer, an auto and motorcycle magazine publisher and ex-Indian West Coast distributor. Clymer worked on the revival of the brand until 1967 or 68, but that came to a halt with his death. Said Stark, his widow sold the business to a Mr. Alan Newman. He made some small motorcycles, 50 cc's to 125 cc's. They went into production and were the third highest selling motorcycle by volume worldwide in the early 70s. They bore the Indian motorcycle nameplates and looked like dirt bikes. They were sold in the US too. By 1974, the company went bankrupt. The Indian name went up for sale in a bankruptcy court. There were several bidders: Carmen DeLeon, a Newport Beach, California businessman, Bob Stark, and even Steve McQueen. DeLeon had the winning bid, a paltry $10,000. His import facility in the U.S. burned down and nothing was sold after that. DeLeon would franchise the name to anyone who would buy it. Enter Philip S. Zangi. This was in 1988 or 89. They had meetings where DeLeon had bad vibes and an agreement was discussed where Zangi said he would pay for the whole operation. Zangi never put up 15 cents. According to Stark, DeLeon's claim on the Indian trademark faded when he failed to produce a motorcycle within the allotted 7 years the U.S. Trademark Office provides trademark protection. Later, Zangi started to license Indian banjos, Indian jewelry, Indian motorcycle t-shirts, jackets, and even trading cards. According to Stark, however, a trademark has not been issued to Zangi. Then it talks about Wayne Bogman from Albuquerque, New Mexico. with his plans on building his bikes. Nevertheless, I really just wanted to stay focused on my company, always trying to expand the lines and produce the highest quality products, while all the time protecting the Canadian trademark. Chapter 95. We were planning to move Indian Motorcycle to its own location on 60 Wingold Avenue, just north of Eglinton, west of Dufferin Street. There were a lot of clothing distributors and manufacturers in this area. It was like the clothing district of the North at the time. It was a crucial time, and we were in the process of demolishing the inside of the building. My father, who was a partner at KPMG at the time, had Raj, one of his employees, doing the financial statements and tax returns since 1992. Raj came to King Street office in August 1994. The Ego Man was very involved with the gay community and the event Fashion Cares. In 1994, Indian Motorcycle bought a table for all the staff and had an ad in the program. We had accounts on Church Street and elsewhere and were always involved in gay pride. On one occasion, the Kemper leaves for Europe with the Ego Man, obviously on Indian's tab. When they came back, I was working away on the line and started noticing pieces were coming into the showroom that the Ego Man was having made. This really blew my mind. I guess he thought he was the star of a Hollywood movie. Just kidding about Hollywood. I just love the song by Eric Burton and War, Spill the Wine. He had been talking about putting a washroom in his office at 60 Wingold Avenue, the new home of Indian Motorcycle Clothing, and this was making me very nervous. I decided that there was no way I was going forward with the Ego Man. I started taking pieces like Polar Fleece shorts and a lot of his others out of the line. I can still remember him saying, "You're taking a scalpel to my line." In all honesty, I respected him, and he was talented, just way ahead of his time. Chapter 96. We used a small architecture design company, Otbo and Associates. I was working very closely with one of the female owners when it came to the textures and colors. She came up with a huge accent, which was using linoleum, something they used in the old days and was making a comeback. It was for the flooring in the main entrance and walkways. Plus, she suggested that we have a logo cut into the floor at the entrance. I love that idea and chose a logo that had no words in it, just the 3-colored double circle Indian headdress. I picked all the colors using a dark gray and ecru textured color for the floor. The logo had red in it, so the woman suggested we use red triangles facing certain directions to show which way to go. The walls were ecru/cream with a black rubber trim at the bottom, and the ceiling was painted charcoal gray, which faded away from the black track lighting. We had a beautiful reception desk that was pine with a black top and a stainless steel trim in between. The showrooms were warmer and had dark brown hardwood flooring. I knew someone who made wood furniture, and I asked him to make some items using distressed black pine, such as rolling racks, open cabinets for displaying shirts on shelves, and on top we'd arrange belts and other items. He made cabinets with doors, blanket boxes, and belt buckle displays, so you could display buckles and keep inventory behind. I would silkscreen Indian Motorcycle logos in red on everything so it could be sold to retailers. We had distressed black wood trim on the top of the 3.5 high window ledge throughout to cap the ecru/cream walls. In the pool room, we had distressed black tongue and groove pine down the sides of the walls under the windows. Of course, we had a pool table with a stereo and leather recliners, as well as a refrigerated beer fridge, which held a keg from which we could pour ice-cold beer. My friend James Jimmy Ward, who owned a company called Legacy Leather, gave us samples of leather recliners with Indian Motorcycle logos. He also made a couch and logo embossed chair for my office. I had an old style drafting table and chair that his wife Mary Franz sold me. She was a designer and extremely cool lady. He made a leather couch and chair for the reception area too. The area in the middle was the work hub, where there were cubicles for the staff, and all around were the main offices, showrooms, boardroom/showroom, pool room, and kitchen. In that back half of the building were shelves for inventory and an area at the very back with a sliding door for shipping. I put up a hoop, but I didn't use it much. I think the ceiling might have been a little too low, but either way the offices were looking great, and I felt like I had created a beautiful home for Indian Motorcycle clothing.
How you doing? I'm Fuss Cooper. Here we are at Indian Motorcycle. Here's Elise, working in the front. Let's cruise in here. This is the showroom. And you can see there's my 1932 Indian Scout right there. You can come over here and you see that we do belt buckles and we have belts. These heavy duty leather jackets. You know, we try to make the jackets very authentic, and when they buy this jacket, they'll have it for the rest of their life. You know, all the different logos that you see, posters that we print, our hats. Then let's go through here. And you see what I've done is we've put a lot of the memorabilia on the wall so that people could understand what Indian Motorcycle was, because a lot of people don't know about it. They see the clothes, they don't know what Indian Motorcycle was, and it was the biggest manufacturer of motorcycles in the world at one time in Springfield, Massachusetts. And so we're trying to create like a little museum here, you know. Here's just more memorabilia as we cruise down here. This is my favorite room, and there's a couple of customers in here. But this is the pool room. You know, because we gotta have our Indian Motorcycle relaxation. Things get a little crazy here. There's memorabilia everywhere so that people, when they're in here waiting for the sales rep or whatever, they're learning about Indian Motorcycle. They're walking around here and they're understanding what it was and where it came from. So let's cruise out here, and we cruise down here, more memorabilia, you know, just learning about Indian Motorcycle all the way back to 1901. And we come up to the Indian Motorcycle Cafe where the staff eat lunch, you know. We want to make it fun for them. So we kind of made this little place. And you can see there's different people that wear our stuff. I mean, all kinds of people wear it, from Jeff Healy to Deborah Cox. And we go through here. This is, you know, where our little machines are. Here, all memorabilia. There's the baseball team. Anything that we can find that people can see what Indian was. That's the whole idea about plastering this place with all kinds of things. And we'll cruise through here and go into my office, which is probably the messiest office because, you know, I'm always going crazy. There's some more leather furniture by a leather furniture guy. But this is my little collectibles, you know, kinds of things that I collect, authentic Indian stuff that was from, you know, 1901 to 1953. And that's the place, you know, so what can I say?
Chapter 97. I was still trying to figure out how I would end my relationship with the Ego Man and how much I would have to pay him to walk away. Then I would see if the Sly Man would be my partner and come with me to 60 Wingold Avenue. Meanwhile, my sister moved to Winnipeg. Danny was offered a job he couldn't refuse. He followed his father, Sam Ruth, who was the former Baycrest executive director and foundation president. Danny had taken up the same business as his father, and was quite good at his job, hence the constant stream of new job offers. Winnipeg was not a place that I was looking forward to visiting. Nevertheless, I did go once and actually stood at Portage in Main, an intersection that has been mentioned in many Canadian musicians' songs. It was the fucking coldest corner I've ever stood on. At the time, I was really digging the live music on College Street when a new bar opened called the Orbit Room. A couple fellows I'd met at College Street Bar named Tim Nodder and Alec Lifeson were the owners. It was now my favorite establishment. You entered up a thin stairway to the second floor where there was a girl taking the cover charge. On many weekends, there would be a line-up all the way up the stairs. Lucky I knew people. It was very small and thin, with a bar at the front, which had seating, and across from it was a banquette and some tables and stools. In the front area, there were tables on the right and left, so people could dance in the middle, and they were always dancing. When it opened, they served food. However, after some years, they stopped that. They realized who needed food. It's much better to just have the bar and open at a later hour. However, the kitchen was still very convenient for private parties. At the end of the tables, there was a stage, which always had a vintage Hammond B3 organ on it. This gave the sound that very special accent. You could walk past the stage to the bathrooms, just past the kitchen, and if you continued, you'd reach a patio, which was perfect for boshing. There was always a cover, and the admission price depended on who was playing. When it started, the house band was the Dexters, who played on the always packed weekends. During the week, they had different soul, R&B, blues, and jazz bands. I went there weekly, sometimes 2 or 3 times. It was an amazing, small, and intimate venue. Sadly, it closed from COVID in 2020. It was the last live music I saw. I hope it's not the last I will ever see. Meanwhile, Yonge and Eglinton was starting to have some action. Aside from Sparks/Broadway Bob's, a Toby's Good Eats opened just north of Franz along Yonge Street east of Yonge. On Eglinton, there was a sports bar called Hector's, and east of that was Shark City, a very cool bar/restaurant. It also had some really nice-sized pool tables. The design of the place was done in a very cool, upscale, modern way. They had these haunting marble drink rails that were charcoal gray, and they sort of resembled shark fins coming out of the wall. It looked cool, but the problem was, when you put your drink on it, it would just slide right off, and it was angled downward. I can't remember how many drinks I lost because of that. The place was designed by 2x4 Design, and you will see how history repeats itself as the story unfolds. One amazing night, I was there playing some late-night pool, and in walks Lenny Kravitz. He's with about 10 women, obviously all of them were hot. He starts playing at the table beside me. A friend of mine had given him some Indian Motorcycle tees from me. I knew he loved Indian Motorcycle, yet I never got the nerve to tell him I was the Indian Motorcycle dude. That's just the way I was. Memories like these are a sober reminder that so many great places are now gone, and who knows what will happen to live music, bars, restaurants, and entertainment venues, which are some of the industries that were hit the hardest by the pandemic. I guess we'll have to just wait and see. Chapter 98. Having been exposed to the area of Lake Simcoe and loved it, Sharon started to rent a cottage down the street from us. There was a dentist who was married with 2 young girls who owned a property with 2 cottages. She rented the cottage beside them. She had 2 boys and it was a lot of fun, especially when my nieces and nephew came to visit with my sister. There was a manufacturer I'd met that wanted to make jackets for Indian Motorcycle. I may have met him when I was out at a bar, I'm not sure. We met with this gentleman at his company downtown. It was on Carla Avenue. I can't remember the name of the guy or the company. Neither is very important, yet We were in the boardroom having a meeting about a certain jacket. There was my production assistant, the Kemper, and I. There seemed to be a problem with a sample jacket that he made for us to approve. We were going back and forth about some problems with the jacket, and the guy just didn't understand what we were saying. I couldn't deal with it anymore, and stood up and said, I know what the problem is. The problem is that this guy is an idiot.
Uncle Claude, are you an idiot?
We got up and all left, mumbling to ourselves. I must admit, that was one of my lines, yet, are you an idiot? Is mostly meant to be endearing whenever I say it, although sometimes people have misunderstood. Now everybody says idiot, whether it's in a TV series or in a movie, whatever. Unfortunately, my production assistant eventually left us due to the fact that she couldn't handle what was going on between my partners and I. We were constantly squabbling, and I couldn't blame her for wanting to get away from that. Nevertheless, the best thing about her was that she brought us Fong, who was an amazing production assistant. She was the most organized person, plus her written word was so clean and neat. I called her the Fongatola. As for my old production assistant, I got her a job at the Incredible Clothing Company, and I would still see her when I was there overseeing samples or production. Everything happens for a reason, man. Chapter 99. I still had to sort out the problem with my business partners. I went to the Sly Man, and even though he had lied to my face before about the house sales, I decided to take a chance, as he knew all the retailers. I told him I'm buying the Ego Man out, and I'm giving him $250,000. Do you want to come with me? I figured that if I wanted out, what would 50% be worth? I estimated that the company at the time was worth $1 million. The Sly Man said yes. I told him I would lend him the money so we would be equal partners and that he had to pay me back in 2 years. He agreed. When we were ready to make the move in April 1995, I told the Ego Man I was buying him out. He gladly accepted, and we had a final meeting at his lawyer's office for lunch. After having a crummy sandwich, I handed him the $250,000 check and said, "Thanks for lunch, man." I was tying up all the loose ends. I still had to deal with my old high school president, Joe, the lawyer. He had really grabbed a hold of us, realizing that we were a cash cow for him. You knew you always had to protect your trademark, so it's not like we didn't make sure to use him. After having a meeting with him, he offered us a deal that we couldn't refuse, and just like that, we had an in-house lawyer. We took my pal Raj, the controller, and of course the Fongatola, Kathy, who looked after office things, Peter, the sales rep, and Jeff Schwartz, who I called Schwitz, the shipper. It was a tight-knit crew, and I felt like we had assembled a great team and we were going to accomplish amazing things. I was really creating a unique atmosphere at our new digs on 60 Wingold Avenue. I started a black and white poster collection and had them plaque-mounted with a matte finish. I hung them on the walls throughout and noted everything was for sale. Our retailers could buy whatever I designed and could put in their retail outlets. We also printed some two-color posters on ecru/cream paper for the vintage feel, which we printed and gave to retailers. I was all about expanding the brand. When you entered Indian Motorcycle Clothing Co., it was like a modern/vintage museum concept. I had a red neon sign reading Indian Cafe in script writing installed over the doorway of the kitchen. It was a glimpse of the future, man. I started to purchase and collect Indian motorcycle memorabilia and displayed it throughout my office, in the showrooms, and anywhere else I could display them. I bought Xerox collections of old Indian motorcycle ads, scoured them for anything to do with vintage motorcycles. Gerald's buddy Jeff Grigsby in Bayfield, just east of Durango in Colorado, was an amazing connection. He owns Indian Motor Works. He had bought a lot of Gerald's father's collection of Indian motorcycles. He also had a lot of Indian motorcycle memorabilia. He graciously invited me to stay with him for a couple days to see his operation and peruse what I wanted to buy. Jeff was a great guy, and his company was restoring and upgrading vintage Indian motorcycles. He was actually building many special fixtures and tooling, which allowed him to restore the bikes so his customers would have none of the old problems of the original motors that they were famous for. This enabled him to sell his restored versions for the highest possible price. While I wasn't able to buy any of those amazing bikes, I did purchase a fair amount of printed items, such as manuals and brochures. I bought pins, oil cans, spark plugs, and basically anything that had the logo on it. I snagged an amazing neon clock, which I reprinted the glass front. It said Indian Motorcycle across the top of the inner printed circle, and sales on the bottom right and service on the left. In the middle of sales and service, centered at the bottom in a banner, it said USA, which I changed to Canada. I own the trademark and I wanted to show it. We had a great time and would be friends forever. After acquiring all these vintage amazing pieces, I blew up tons of great visuals, had them laminated and mounted on plaqueboard, and hung them everywhere. There were certain original Indian ads, which I also framed. I had some more expensive items displayed on the 3.5-foot high distressed black shelving under the windows in my office. The place was really something, and I was making things happen. I then designed a cool stainless steel cutout of one of the many rare Indian motorcycle scripts from my collection and had it pinned off the wall behind the receptionist. It was to match the stainless steel trim on the reception desk. The most essential piece was yet to come, and I knew I had to see my buddy Gerald for it. I'd actually mentioned it to him when I was beginning the Wingold project. I went to see him and said, "It's time for a bike, Danius." He said, "Fussius, let's go pick one out." We went to see his collection, and he charged me $18,000 for a beautiful bike. It was a fair price, and I'll never forget the day he drove it up to 60 Wingold Avenue. It was a 1932 green and cream Indian Scout, and it looked incredible in the showroom, matching the ecru/cream walls. This completed the concept of a modern vintage museum showcasing motorcycle clothing in a hybrid installation/warehouse/offices. A moment that shocked me shortly thereafter was my father asking me, "Hey Fussy, can I work for you?" I was surprised to say the least, but I said, "I'll check it out with my partner," who agreed to take him on, and we paid him a salary of $24,000. Just like that, my father was now working for me. It was cool having him there, and we'd go for lunch all the time. I said to him, "Listen, I have money now, and I don't want you to ever pay for lunch again." Years later, he denied that I'd done that. Plus, he would also say that he never got paid a salary too. What can you do? I also created a stat room in my office, the same one I'd started with at Amazing Graphics. It had followed me from 2 offices with Sharon all the way to King Street, and now was on 60 Wingold Avenue. I'd had it for over 10 years and was still using it, but after a while I realized that it was time to modernize my ways. It was about 6 to 8 months shortly thereafter that we hired a student through my friend Stuart Solway. I found the student to be a little artsy/nerdy. He was a nice kid and all, I just didn't feel I was bonding with him. However, the Sly Man got along with him well and worked on jobs like our website, which I wasn't really into at the time. It was 1996 and the web was still pretty new. I didn't think I needed to concentrate on that because I was still doing designs in my office and still using my Stat camera, but the times were definitely changing. Chapter 100. Working more closely with the Slime Man now, I was sort of getting to know him better. He was completely different than I was. He wore white dress shirts most days with a sweater vest and jeans or dress pants. I was always weary of him, and I never felt he was an Indian motorcycle type of guy. Nevertheless, he was my partner, so I went with it. The Slime Man came up with the idea of having a newsletter that we could give to our customers. I thought it was a great idea and would be a good project for the student. I found an original header logo from an original Indian motorcycle newsletter. It was called the Indian Post, and we printed it on brown/beige paper folded in the middle. There was copy on the front under the header logo and an old Indian motorcycle ad on the full back page. I also found a great original border to frame the top and bottom on the right and left inside pages. I supplied the student with all the art that would be needed and oversaw the layout. There was only 2 issues released. I wasn't really concerned about the content, except for mentioning how we came to call our new home the Wigwam, the same as the original Indian motorcycle factory in Springfield, Mass. used to be called. I was surprised to see in the first issue the mention of my 1932 Indian Scout. The article was titled, "We've Tracked Down a Scout." Considering it was the first Indian that I'd purchased, it was also surprising to read in the article about the Wigwam when it said, "We picked up some amazing furniture from a Toronto dealer, including a turn-of-the-century drafting table." This was my drafting table that I had purchased from my buddy James Jimmy Ward's wife, Marie. Once again, it was the Sly Man at work, trying to take credit where credit wasn't due. My next memorabilia journey consisted of going to see a fellow that I found while searching magazine for collectors of vintage motorcycle paraphernalia and memorabilia. His name was David Wasserman, whose small ad stuck out as it had an illustration of him, a long-bearded dude with a motorcycle for a brain. The metaphor was perfectly simple and self-explanatory. I had to meet him. He lived in Morgantown, West Virginia. I flew into a small airport where he picked me up. He was like an old hippie and was driving his beat-up pickup truck. We arrived at his place, and there was a pond right in front. He said, "You can cool off in the swimming hole if you want to." It looked pretty muddy, and even though it was scorching out, I decided it wasn't a good idea. We went into his place, which was massive and filled with all kinds of memorabilia everywhere. I was in awe. There were so many classic items to look at. I strolled around and picked out a few things. Before I knew it, we were having lunch. After lunch, we smoked a big joint. I could tell it was very strong and only had a few puffs. He was obviously a Bosch connoisseur like myself, and I respected that. In round 2 of checking out his stuff, I found a lot more items, and it worked out great. It was my first time dealing with a true collector/purveyor. I never saw him again, but we kept in touch. It was a real trip in more ways than one, and demonstrated just how popular the Indian motorcycle brand had remained. I got back and proudly displayed my new pieces in my office. I methodically went through each piece, figuring out how I would use the Indian logos and type on the next designs I would create. I love taking original artwork and reproducing it on clothing. I wanted to keep everything as original as possible, but many times I had to rework things around depending on if it was being printed or embroidered or what size it was going to be. I had a binder that I created with all the designs I had accumulated over the years. It just kept growing and growing until it was one very fat binder. We called it the Indian Bible. It was incredible how many different styles of script writing Indian Motorcycle had used for their logo over the years. It was a true testament to my creativity and the artistic history of the brand. Chapter 101, Mistaken Identity. I decided to use the original Indian logo, which had the profile of the really rough-looking, flat-nosed Indian with a feather in his hair, within a deep red circle. The name around the outer circle, around the top, was Indian Motorcycle, and around the bottom was the Hendy Manufacturing Co., Springfield, Mass., on 2 lines. Customers who'd bought that shirt weren't paying attention to the salesman, and a lot of them called and complained that we had made a spelling mistake and forgot the R in motorcycle. Let's just say it was a good learning experience for them. It also became a popular item. Western Corral was a good customer, and the greed man and me were great friends. I also knew all the employees, as I was always popping in and purchasing a lot of products while receiving great deals along the way. I used to frequent the Orbit Room with Chuck and some of the girls that worked at Western Corral. One of the girls was Joey, who I called Joish. Chuck would always be driving us home last because she only lived south of me. When we get to her apartment and she'd be getting out, she'd always say, "You coming in, Fuss Cooper?" I never would. She would always tell me how all day long at Western Corral, suppliers would be calling about unpaid bills. I'd heard that a supplier came in there once swinging a baseball bat so he could get paid. John Brown, the belt maker, would tell me how he would call there to get paid, and they would always say, "We can't find the invoice. Can you please fax it to us again?" Apparently they did that with all their suppliers. It made me sick, as both owners were cousins and came from very wealthy families. I tried not to think about it when we hung out. However, I would find out firsthand how greedy my friend really was. The day finally came when, after a night of cruising and Chuck was dropping off Joey's car, she gave me the usual, "You coming in, Fuss Cooper?" This time I actually said, "Yeah, I'm coming in." Chuck had the car door open and was yelling at me, "Don't do it, man, don't do it." Obviously, I didn't listen to him. I had no clue at the time that this was the beginning of the most stressful up and down relationship I would ever experience. Chapter 102. First trip with the Kemper. The Kemper was freelancing for Western Glove/Silver Jeans when we went to Paris. I had to meet him, and I was a little bit freaked about flying there, as it was a long 8-hour flight. I took a sleeping pill, and when I arrived, I was still groggy, and the security guys really hassled me. Eventually, I made it through, and the Kemper was there waiting. I was really excited, as I hadn't been to Europe since I tried to play hoops. The reason for these trips abroad was so we could get ideas and inspiration and to try and create something even better. I was there to give it the Indian touch. We took the Euro Express train to Amsterdam and started checking out the main drag across from the train station. This was where the European chain stores were located. Kemper had been telling me about his method of scouting the stores. It was illegal to start drawing pictures and taking notes in retail stores. If they caught you, they throw you out immediately. So we had to walk through, then leave the store and draw what we saw and liked from memory once we were far enough away. The reason we were in these places was because these people designed clothing with a much more fashion-forward point of view. Yet it was challenging to remember what you just saw 5 seconds before, so I had to really focus when I was checking out the lines. I did eventually get the hang of it, and if the product was extraordinarily detailed and had to be bought, I'd buy it. I was completely loving this experience and learning so much. We also took in a lot of the smoke shops and did some boshing while stopping in at the Bulldog, where I'd been before, back in the day with Chuck. We walked through the famous red light district, where women were literally on display in storefront windows. The next set of stores was called Hoogstraat, across from the Van Gogh Art Gallery. This is where we'd find the high-end independent retailers, where the local people shopped. We walked everywhere, which is what I like to do regardless. And even though the Kemper was almost 7 years older than me, he was in great walking shape. I'd be dragging my boots by the time we were finished for the day. He looked like he could keep going. It was impressive. The next stop on our Euro trip was Antwerp, Belgium, which was a much smaller city, but home to 5 separate fashion colleges, where a lot of famous designers graduated. Everything about the city had an artistic vibe to it. After that, it was back to Paris, where we were the Marais area. This was where the high-end casual streetwear retailers were. I remember the Kemper telling me, watch where you're walking on the sidewalk because they don't clean up the dog shit. That's where the term eau de merde de chien comes from. Translation, the smell of dog shit. From there, we walked into Les Halles, an area where the retailers carried funky streetwear and vintage clothing and whatnot. We continued on and walked through Etienne Marcel, which is all jeanswear. Eventually, we stopped for something to eat, and being the fussy guy I am, especially with food, I found something that I quite enjoyed. It was called a croque monsieur. It was basically a fancy toasted ham and cheese sandwich. After lunch, we connected to La Galerie Lafayette, which was the #1 fashion department store at that time. After that, we finally returned home to Toronto, and it felt great to be back on home soil as usual. There would be more trips to come with the Kemper, but being back at the office, I had to put my tidings from the trip into making samples and tangible products. You always had to design and create a year ahead. I would have to pick which logo looked best, where it was positioned, and what size it would be. Would it be a sewn-on patch, direct embroidery, or printed? Then we'd decide what labels we'd use. There were so many details to iron out, but I lived for it. That being said, it took time to make the perfect prototypes and then make duplicates for the sales rep samples collection. From that point on, the sales reps used the collection to set up appointments and do trade shows to sell all the shit out of the line. By accumulating orders from the retailers, then the samples have to be graded into multiple sizes according to the orders to get into a production run. That's why it takes a year to get production from the conceptual stage to the retailer's shelves for the consumers. We were really rocking, making some amazing pieces, and one that really stands out for me was the nylon bomber jacket we created. Right across the street from us was a company called Avon Sportswear. This little Jewish guy named Albert owned it. He was so funny because he was my father's age and had a receding hairline and wore his hair slicked back into a ponytail. I think he thought he was Karl Lagerfeld, even though he didn't look anything like him. He was a tough negotiator, yet we made thousands of bomber jackets, among other types of jackets, with his company. We also started dealing with Wing Sun Garments, a manufacturer of high-quality activewear. The owner, Chak Wei Chung, who was a really nice man, his company made the best garments by far. They washed all their knits before production, so there was never any shrinkage or torquing, which is the twisting of garments. For anyone who has tried to fold a shirt and can't get the side seams to line up, this prevented that issue. The fabrics and trims they used were fantastic, and their products were always the #1 sellers in the line. I had met a female designer, Leslie Suchuk, who was a super creative talent. I had seen her first samples starting with her company line, Kinsk. The concept was new and innovative, as she would print these cool designs in black and then hand color the inside areas of the designs with colors. I believe her garments were always white and were super high quality. She was also using Wingsun garments. I believe that's how we found them in the first place. She eventually ended Kinsk and created a new company called Marvell, where she was basically a sample maker. I thought it was a great concept, and it definitely worked for me. She was very fashion forward. I loved going to see her collections and buying small production runs of very cool garments, usually made of unique fabrics. The bodies were always right on. Chapter 103. I can't remember what show it was, but I was going to my first show with the Sly Man in Miami. We arrived at the airport, and as we were about to go through the customs line, I somehow lost him, probably on purpose knowing him. I really didn't have any info about where we were staying or where the show was. I had just come back from a trip, and the whole thing was very rushed for me. I found myself at the customs booth, and the custom officer was asking me, "Where are you traveling to today?" "I'm going to a clothing show in Miami." "Where is that being held?" she asked. "I'm not sure. My partner has all the info, but I don't see him. He must have gone in another line." "Where are you staying?" was the next question, to which I had no idea how to answer since the Sly Man had all the info. The next thing I know, I'm in a small room with a few people. Finally, after 45 minutes had passed, I thought to myself, I guess I'm not going. Then an airline worker comes in and asks me for my ticket. After perusing the ticket, they tell me I have the Sly Man's ticket and he has mine. I didn't get mine back, and then I assumed I wasn't going. At that point, I just wanted to get the fuck out of there, as I had a couple buds in my sock. I finally was called in to speak to the officer in charge. His first question is, "Have you ever been in trouble with the police?" "No." "You've never been in trouble with the police?" he snaps back. "No," I emphatically reply. "Does 1989 ring a bell?" Of course I knew it did, and replied, "Well, I got caught smoking a joint, but I got an honorable discharge. My lawyer told me that if I was ever asked if I was in trouble, say no." He looks at me skeptically. "Well, lawyers often tell you the wrong thing. You have to go and get some paperwork done." Phew. I thought it was the Sly Man at work again, leaving me like that. He probably did it on purpose. I was so flustered at the time. He'd taken my ticket and got through customs. How bizarre is that? In the end, I had to go to Pardons Canada, where I first met Ian Levine. He obtained my first waiver for me, which was for 1 year. I had to keep getting waivers that would turn into a 3-year waiver and eventually a 5-year waiver, which I now have today. All of this stress and effort was because I got caught smoking a joint and possessing 1 gram in a container. It's a total money grab for the U.S., but like I always say, it is what it is. I don't travel to the U.S. very often anymore. My trips were really only to see my parents who stayed in Florida in the winters and to visit my sister and my buddy Captain Z. Chapter 104. I bought my first boat. It was from Sharon's neighbor, where she had been renting a cottage. It was the perfect boat for me, a Canadian-made Panther, about 16 or 17 feet. It was red and had a 200 horsepower Mercury engine. It went about 65 miles per hour and came with a speed prop to go even faster. I only tried the speed prop once, as I really only used the boat for skiing. Having worked at so many camps and driving so many different kinds of boats similar to this, i.e. Sidewinder, Glastron, J-Craft, I was pretty confident in my driving abilities. I could make the boat do anything. I was totally in control and practiced all the proper rules and regulations. I was safe, but crazy at the same time. I kept it at Monterino Marina, where I was very familiar with the owners and the people that worked there, as I had been getting gas there in everyone else's boats for years. I would park there and go to my cottage, as there was nowhere to keep the boat. It was just a sandy beach, so when I went there, I would anchor it out in front and just walk in. I loved it, and my nieces and nephew loved it too. It was cool taking friends on rides when it was calm. I'd be able to get to Barrie in 10 to 15 minutes. Normally it took 30 to 40 minutes in a non-speedboat. For my wilder friends, I could go wave jumping and get the boat way out of the water and actually make it stand up at almost 90 degrees. It was the best times for me, as I had grown up for such a long time without having my own boat. I often used to just float out front of my cottage before dinner time and lay on the back seat in the sun listening to tunes and hearing the waves splash against the bottom of the boat. I have so many fond memories. I was still hanging out with Gerald and Lilish, doing the usual things we did, although I did notice Lilish getting affected by the cheapness of Danius. Hey, everyone deals with his own or her own personal shit. I always did my own. I never got jealous, and what anybody had was their business. Nevertheless, how couples acted when they were together had nothing to do with me. One of the saddest things is when one of your friends would be a completely different person when they would be with their other half. I'm always who I am, no matter if I'm with a girl or not. That's why I always ended a relationship if I knew it wasn't cool. I understood and still understand that you have to give a little and that nobody's perfect, but I would never just settle. Maybe that's why I'm a bachelor. I still have friendships with more than a few of the girls I've gone out with. Chapter 105. I was now leasing a black Ford Explorer. I was making more money and I had to see suppliers and carry a lot of samples, etc. I was constantly trying to continue my expansion of the product line. I met Michael Budman through my friend Chuck. He was one of the owners of Roots, and I had a meeting with him and decided to go ahead and make a sample of a biker wallet. They had amazing leather products, which I had always admired. He had a bit of an ego, and when I went to pick up the sample, I thought, man, this is beautiful. Only when I turned it over, on the back, there was the Roots logo. I started cracking up and said, hey man, you can't put your logo on my products. I guess he thought I would like it. We went on to sell hundreds of the wallets. I reluctantly have to say that the Sly Man was responsible for the sales and did a lot of cross promotions. However, I did always feel that he was envious of things I was accomplishing creatively. I didn't care, as I kept just focusing on where Indian Motorcycle was going and how I could keep the idea of high quality associated to the brand. I felt very passionate about making things happen, coming up with new products, new styles, and logos. It was always very exciting. Seeing a print come off the line or a new sample after it was embroidered or otherwise detailed was such an amazing feeling, especially when it turned out exactly how you planned it. Unfortunately, there were still the counterfeiters out there, which always kept our in-house lawyer busy. I'd play pool with Joe and try to keep our friendship going as he was there all the time. It was a little hard for me, as I would always remember the times when I had to kiss his ass and bring him OJ and bagels. Now he was living quite an exciting life. Also, I knew I could trust him when it came to dealing with legal issues, and I was always happy about that. Chapter 106. I was still hooping on Thursday nights at Regina Pace's Collegiate with Ted and the boys. I made some great tank tops in black and ecru and printed on the back property of Ted Galka's workout. The guys love them. I still have a black one in my vintage archives. Or maybe I don't. When I started the Indian Motorcycle clothing line, I only wanted to use black, gray, and ecru, which was a light cream color that I felt was vintage. Black and white were always the best sellers. As the line grew and the denim got hot, blues and reds came in because of the Indian red. It was a dark red and looked vintage, like when Indian used it in their logos. Also touching on the yellow/gold from the Indian oil cans. Eventually, there would be other colors too. I also started to make kids' tees and caps. The first tee I did, I used an original piece of art from an old ad. It featured a little Indian character wearing a headdress. The kids' tees were such a hit, I used adult designs scaled down to add more styles. Chapter 107. I was still cruising to the cottage with my friends and hanging out with my peeps that had cottages up there. Life was always filled with motivation, no matter what it threw at me. I was always keeping the positive energy flowing and found myself learning how to channel that energy. I could feel when the karma wasn't there, and I'd just lay low. I knew it was there when everything I did was snapping into place. That's when I'd try to accomplish as much as I could. That being said, one day I got this crazy call from my brother. He says to me, "Where can I get tie material?" "What do you mean?" I was surprised he was asking me this. He'd always worn crazy pattern-colored shirts. He yells at me, "Just tell me where I can get tie material." I didn't want to ask any questions, so I say, "Call this friend of mine," as he owned a women's clothing company. Later that week, I was in Western Corral, and the greed man tells me my brother was in there and asked him about Indian Motorcycle. Does this shit really sell? I thought about that and figured he must think he can make a line of shirts, seeing what I did with Indian Motorcycle. So why couldn't I create a line of shirts like the kind that I wore all the time? That's when I realized that he must have been jealous of me. I had never really thought about it before. I tried to be aware of that and treat him like a brother should, even though he was always a bit weird. I would find out later how weird he really was. Chapter 108. My next trip with the camper was a little closer to home. We went to Los Angeles and San Francisco in May-June of 1995. This trip was for spring because the West Coast vibe was always about the warm weather. When in LA, we always stayed in Santa Monica because it was the closest to the ocean and Venice Beach. This year, we stayed near Santa Monica's 3rd Street Promenade. It was a mixture of funky independents and chain stores, which carried fashion-forward casual wear. 2 blocks over was Fred Segal Santa Monica, which was a unique multi-dimensional retailer. It had an organic cafeteria and juice bar, sunglass shop, makeup kiosk, and the majority of the store consisted of high-fashion California casual clothing. They had all the elements that made up the typical California lifestyle. Then we visited Venice Beach, and of course I saw the Jimi Hendrix impersonator Harry Perry on his roller skates. He was doing his thing back and forth on the boardwalk, as always. That brought such a smile to my face that he was still rolling. Wherever I'd be, I was always looking out for new concepts when it came to food or entertainment. We even saw a hoop game on one of the courts. It was hilarious, as there was this particular hooper that whenever he missed a shot, he yelled, "Damn!" And it seemed like he would do it every time. I'd copy that expletive for a while when I'd miss a shot. Damn! I thought it was hilarious. Eventually, we went to Fred Segal Melrose. This one was more upscale, as he was trying to cater to the Beverly Hills set. From there, we just cruised Melrose Avenue for research, as they'd always have the hottest item, and it was easy to tell, as all the other retail stores had it too. It was a great street to watch what people were wearing. To make that point even greater, I want to say how important it is to watch what people are wearing anywhere you are. It's like looking at signage and ads, like I had always done for graphic design. Everything is out there, man. You just have to be aware and to know how to see it and apply it to when the time is right. We went to San Francisco after we'd seen our fill of LA, and our first stop was to stroll around the area of Haight-Ashbury. It was like being in a time warp, and memories of my first trip there with Machen LePew came flooding back to me. After that trip down memory lane, it was on to Union Square, which was the main shopping area of San Francisco. It consisted of independent retailer chain stores and department stores. It was another successful trip, but as I've said before, it's always amazing to be home in TO. I found out that Morley had built a large house that was right beside 417 Richview Avenue. How surreal was that? Living on that street for years, then getting married, and living in two other places, then building a house right beside our old stomping grounds. Chapter 109. I was now working on samples using standard vintage fabrics, mostly 100% cotton, example 1x1 rib and 2x2 rib, jersey, velour, thermal/waffle, and high-quality fleece and polar fleece. The fabrics evolved with the addition of lycra, which previously we had been using on the cuffs and collars of many items. There was also outerwear, which consisted of brushed cotton and various weights and constructions of nylon, satin nylon for the bomber jackets, nailhead nylon for jean jackets, and similar styles. Moreover, our selection of leathers, including distressed vintage, featuring the favorite and iconic Indian motorcycle biker jacket, they featured the classic tea-stained chenille crest, which were made on original vintage chenille machines and stained by me until I trained the manufacturer. This was extremely important as it gave it the real authentic look. In addition, we had our non-distress, smooth as butter skins. You'd also have to add new styles, which would have new Indian designs applied to them. Furthermore, we expanded our accessory lines of belts, keychains, and headwear. I was always looking for a new product that would be great for the line, and found it with the ceramic Indian motorcycle card holder, which I bought from an ad in the Indian Motorcycle Illustrated magazine. Chuck had a company that made gift baskets and was using a supplier to make ceramic items that went in said baskets. He made the introductions, and I took the Indian card holder example there, eventually coming up with a prototype. Then we made a small production run for our retailers and sales agents. They loved them, and it was great for displaying their business cards. I also started to design sterling silver Indian motorcycle jewelry. I had picked up some vintage pins that I used to start with. Then I had to find people that could cast the jewelry and some that could create from my ideas. I used a company called Toronto Gold Cast, which was owned by a beautiful older Filipino lady whose name was Teresa. I would always joke about taking her out, to which she giggled. The funny thing was, I really did want to. I also created bracelets, rings, pendants, and pins over the years. The main reason I started the jewelry was my personal love of wearing it and the creative process that went into designing and making it. Eventually, once I had enough pieces, I had to decide how it would be displayed at retail. This led me to finding a woodworking company that could make a display case. They were located on DuPont, just west of Spadina. It was convenient as it was located close to where I lived. I designed a small display case out of wood with a glass window and back door. It was stained black to match our other Indian motorcycle fixtures. Then I created a charcoal foam insert that had Indian Motorcycle black and charcoal side seam label that was used as a tab to pull the insert in and out. It was then Indianized, a term we used to describe adopting it to our style, by screen printing genuine Indian jewelry in our Indian Motorcycle dark red across the top of the case. Although the jewelry sold, I was surprised that it never sold as well as I had hoped. However, that never dampened my enthusiasm or pride in wearing it. Chapter 110. I've been going out with Joish and friends all the time, but I was finding it hard to be with somebody all the time. I really liked her. I just found that she was quite needy, and for me that was hard to be around. Yet I didn't want to give up on the relationship, so I just tried to be Keel. I helped her with her new venture, a personal shopping service called Let's Go Shopping, for which I designed the brochures. She was very resourceful and knew where to get great deals and where to find the products clients wanted. I have to give her credit, as she was always thinking of how she could turn her skills into profit. Unfortunately, things weren't working out with us, and I had to do something about it. As mentioned, if I didn't think it was going to work, I had to be honest, be stronger, and speak up and end it. Then try to remain friends, which is what I did with Joish. Chapter 111. September trip to London with the Kemper. Once again, I was super excited, as I hadn't been to London since I was with Chuck way back in the day. The reason we were there was to research the fall collection. We started the tour with Soho Carnaby Street for their upscale casual clothing, shown in a variety of chain stores and independents. The next area was Camden Market, which was a group of outdoor booths showing vintage British clothing. It was always interesting researching vintage clothing in different countries because each country had a different vibe. From there we went to Kensington High Street. At that time, there was a multi-level indoor flea market, which was a collection of small independent importers and manufacturers. Essentially, it was people who made their own clothing and retailed it. While we were there, we found the women's crop bomber jacket. This was the perfect item to introduce women's outerwear. It became a huge hit and made us realize immediately that we should be developing a collection, and we did just that. To keep the line diverse, you had to create different bodies / styles, and you had to use new graphics, applications, trims, and fabrics. I had the Kemper, so the fits and dimensions were always right on. One of my favorite fabrics was brush cotton. It was perfect for the spring and summer jackets, as you didn't have to have lining. I loved picking the application that would best suit the product. For example, the men's racer jacket, which had 2 vertical stripes down the front, left side, and red and gray 5/8 wide, made out of horizontal ribbed satin. The right chest had Indian Motorcycle script embroidery in silver, and the cut was short waist length. It was collared with a silver front zipper, 2 zippered pockets, and the back had vented shoulders with eyelets so it could breathe and give it the racer look. Of course it was black, and the cotton was so soft it really felt and looked vintage. We had a men's service jacket that was a boxier cut, a little longer, and had a waistband with adjustable tabs detailed with Indian snaps. On the left side, above the zippered pocket, there was a rectangular crest, black with silver lock stitch mirror border, with block letters saying Indian Dealer in silver. This is just 2 of many that we created. In examining the women's bomber jacket sample that we had purchased on our trip to London, the interesting factor that it was red. That was a focal point because red was one of our colors, but we would never do a red jacket for men. This was another epiphany that women's outerwear and how colors could be used, such as silver and gold. We took the detailing from her men's bomber jacket and applied it to this woman's sample, thereby Indianizing it, as we had done with previous samples. That's where the Kempers proficiently excelled, in the understanding of the women's fit and the fact that the details from the men's bomber had to have a feminine vibe. I then picked a finer Indian motorcycle script for the back embroidery and used the same small bike embroidery as the men's for the left chest. Thanks to the Kemper's pattern skills, the fit was amazing, and the women's bomber jacket went on to be a huge success. Most likely, this was because Indian Motorcycle was the first to introduce this style of jacket on a large scale to the marketplace. After the trip to London, I started working with Parkhurst Knitwear. I had seen a great sweater with a really cool low roll neck. I wasn't into turtlenecks, and it was hard to find a great neckline. Nevertheless, I met with the salesperson and said I want a heavy black sweater with a small roll neck and cuffs and bottom to match, and it has to be 100% cotton. I found out that they used a blend of 70% cotton, 25% acrylic, and 5% of various other fabrics. I told them I wanted the Indian script big on the front in ecru cream, and on both the upper arms, Scout in regular thin block letters encased with a stripe at the top and bottom, which was the same thickness as the letters. It took them a few times to get it right, but eventually they did. It was so cool, and the sweater line began to sell, and sell well it did. I just kept on designing new samples, such as a much lighter weight version of the first roll neck I'd done. I asked them if they could take a logo and somehow emboss it to give it texture through the knitting process so you could see it and feel it. I picked the initial original feather-faced head logo for the sample. Once again, they did a few samples, and after nailing down the right placement, we had a winner, which we did in black and also ecru. The sweater line just kept on growing, but the best seller was always the Scout heavy roll neck. I also did another version of that with Chief on the arms. Chapter 112. After working together for a while, the time had come where I gave in to the desires and attraction I was having while working and getting to know the Fangatola. It had been over a year. One day I was in my truck with her and something happened and I kissed her. That was it. A feeling came over me, and I guess her too. I started seeing her on a regular basis outside of work. She was a great person, and we did a lot of things together. I took her to Florida to my parents' place, which brings up a memorable story. Indian Motorcycle was doing great, and I was feeling great too. Fong and me were out for dinner with my parents and their friends. I knew them all since I was younger, and when the bill came, I didn't want to deal with them figuring out who owed what, and I also thought it would be nice if I just paid for the whole thing. So we snuck off to the bar, and Fong figured out what I should tip, and I paid the bill with my credit card. We went back in, and I guess I said I took care of the bill. The people all said thank you and showed their appreciation. However, on the way back to the condo, my father says, "So now you're a big shot." I didn't say anything in return. I just thought, man, you try and do something nice, the least you could get is a thank you. Not him, apparently. I really had some fun with Fong. There's no need to go into all the good times we had. It's not like some big thing happened. She was perfect, maybe too perfect. Yet at the end of the day, I just didn't see myself in a relationship. I had to tell her, and when I did, she was pretty cool about it. Thank God I didn't fuck that up and lose a great employee and a great friend. which we are still great friends today. Chapter 113. Big news. Toronto gets an NBA team and the Toronto Raptors are born. The first game was November 3rd, 1995. Indian Motorcycle gets season's tickets, which we shared with one of the Sly Man's friend whose family owned a huge real estate company. It was amazing after so long since being at the game in 1969. I took my father and all my friends to the games. We had great seats about 20 rows up at half court, right beside the aisle. I loved it. The Toronto Raptors concluded their first season winning 21 games and losing 61. Not a horrible start for an NBA expansion franchise. Either way, it was the beginning of the two Canadian teams in the NBA. Vancouver also had a team called the Grizzlies. Unfortunately, following the 2001 season, it relocated to Memphis, Tennessee. While keeping the Grizzlies name, the Raptors remain the only team in Canada to this date. Around this time, I met a girl named Julie, who was a compliance officer for a large stock company. She was in great shape and loved to rollerblade, among other things. Her parents had been religious, and they were very strict. However, she wasn't super religious, but she did keep kosher. I called her the kosher Tuts. Tuts coming from a word that my friend Steve used all the time, tutsik, which meant chick. We rollerbladed over to Steve's one night. It was very hot that day. He lived around Lawrence and Avenue Road, about a 15-minute drive away, so it was quite far for a blade. I never forgot when we walked in through his door, in our blades, of course. I was wearing my shorts and a tank top, and the kosher Tuts was wearing these skin-tight athletic gray workout tights and a tank top. We were both sweating, and Steve couldn't stop staring at the kosher Tuts' crotch, as there was a little perspiration there, and also her tights were creeping up between her legs. Today it's called a camel toe. We hung out for a while, rested, and then bladed home. It was quite a workout. I proceeded to go out with her for a while, but once again, with many tears from both of us, I had to end the relationship. We remained good friends. Chapter 114. I was doing my usual thing, going to the cottage with friends, skiing, tossing the bee in the shallows with Gerald and Lilish. I was still going to concerts and the usual bars, as well as checking out new ones. One of these in particular was the Left Bank on Queen Street, which had just opened up, and I happened to know the doorman, J.D. and Clay. It was a really cool concept. Naturally, they had nice pool tables, which had gold-colored felt. The pool tables were located downstairs below the main floor, and the upstairs level, which you got to by going up a curved staircase with a wrought iron railing. The best thing about it was they attracted a very eclectic and star-studded crowd, like pro athletes, movie stars, and musicians. They were the first to incorporate a restaurant/bar where celebs would love to dine. You couldn't get in if you didn't know the guys at the door or have a connection. This was basically true about all bars and venues that were hot at the time. The floor above the Left Bank held the offices of Revolver Films, owned by Don Allen, which he started in 1983. Don owned the building and would throw his amazing revolver parties, which I always looked forward to attending. This led to him joining forces with Nick DiDonato and forming the Liberty Group. Shortly thereafter, they leased the building across the street and opened up the Velvet Underground, above which the Liberty Group had their offices. Then they opened a bunch of great venues, which was meticulously restored into a multi-level 180-seat dining gym with an upper mezzanine piano bar and a cigar lounge. It had a 17,000 square foot interior boasting 22-foot ceilings and hardwood floors. I went to a lot of film festival, TIFF, after parties because they were one of the first venues to get an extended license so they could serve late into the night. It was always the place to be at that time. Then right around the corner, in another magnificent landmark building on Adelaide, they opened the courthouse. With this space, they designed a different feeling and flavor, with more casual decor, serving comfort food. It had a restaurant on the main floor and a nightclub above. Next up was the Liberty Grand Entertainment Complex, the biggest of all of them, with over 100,000 square feet of event space. It was another huge, magnificent landmark building that, at one time, was only used 3 weeks a year as an exhibitor's pavilion, lending itself to various industrial and agriculture demonstrations at the CNE. This became the Liberty Entertainment Group's offices. Aside from holding many large events, including the opening of the Toronto International Film Festival, TIFF, which I loved attending for almost 10 years, eventually Revolver Films moved their offices into the space above the Velvet Underground, where they have remained since. Meanwhile, the Liberty Group went on to open many more venues in the U.S. and throughout the city of Toronto and still operates some popular venues today. Donna has been doing it for more than 40 years, and we're still friends. Before COVID-19, we'd sometimes go out on the town with our mutual friend, Dr. Bob Feely. Dr. Bob is my dentist and a great friend who just happens to have a cottage right across from where I grew up in the summers, although I didn't meet him until later, which is pretty amazing and quite serendipitous. He's still my dentist, and when this pandemic is over, which it is, I hope we'll be cruising with him once again, and I have. Chapter 115. The student that was working for us at Indian left, and I had to find a new computer person. I interviewed a girl who told me, "I'm not the person for you, Fuss, but my boyfriend would be perfect." Enter Jeff Legend Eisen. He was extremely capable and had amazing computer skills. When we worked together, I would design by sitting beside him for long periods of time, giving instructions that he would carry out to the letter. It worked so well that I don't think I ever used my stat camera again. One of the new projects we started to do was to create posters for our retailers. I had this European magazine that I found somewhere, and in the middle there was a 2-page spread for an ad for Stop Smoking. It was a painting of an old red Indian chief in the middle of a field. The tagline was "Stop smoking or you'll become extinct." I thought it was fantastic, especially for the hidden meaning, which was that I had resurrected Indian Motorcycle, at least the clothing element to this point. I cut the 2 pages out, we scanned them, and Jeff photoshopped them together. We put an Indian Motorcycle logo on the top section, and on the bottom, in print, it read, "Wear a piece of American history." It was perfect, and I would use that image on many things to come. Jeff and I were a great fit, as he understood how I worked, and I think he really appreciated what he was learning from me. We created countless new designs and so much more. I'd show him my reference library, which had tons of books on vintage motorcycle brands, old symbols of America, and vintage oil cans. What is more, I had books on vintage motorcycle jackets, along with many others containing all sorts of helpful visuals. Though with Jeff, the best was yet to come. Chapter 116. I'd been thinking a lot about my life and if I would ever settle down. Somehow, Joish kept creeping back into my mind, probably because I'd see her when I was at Western Corral. She was great looking, even though that's not my number one requirement. She had a unique personality and was a fun person to be around. Plus, she was Jewish, not that that's a requirement either. I was almost 40, and I think that was the main reason why I decided to take the big plunge and move into her apartment. Oh boy. It was a great beginning. She was a very funny person and was amazingly organized and creative too. Not to mention very artsy as well. One of the things she did that used to crack me up was she'd wear what she called her eye tee when she went to sleep. An eye tee was a piece of one of her old T-shirts that she would put over her eyes to sleep with. I always said, Josh, you should create a product called the eye tee and sell it. At some point, I told Fong to move into my old apartment as I didn't want to give it to just anyone. The rent was so cheap. I think when I moved in, it was $350 a month, and when I moved out, it was $750. Eventually, Fong moved in, which made me happy. Unsurprisingly, I didn't last with Joish. There were way too many ups and downs, and this was the second go-around. I was emotionally drained as I was a sensitive guy, always taking the other person's feelings into account. I just couldn't do it, and I left and moved into Chuck's place. He had moved into a big house on Melrose Avenue, just north of Lawrence and west of Avenue Road. It was great living and hanging with Chuck. I was so lucky to have such a great friend. We had some amazing times living together, and I have some hilarious stories that I can't mention in this book. I'll never forget them, and that is for sure. Chapter 117. Things at Indian continued to move forward, and we kept coming up with new and exciting lines. We developed our leathers line with an ex-Cymax employee in Vancouver. It was Henry Wittenberg, who had worked at Cymax and left to open his new company called Rag Trade. They manufactured the same products as Cymax had done. Sales continued to be strong, and I started to develop a few more styles, such as a unisex bomber jacket we called the Flight Jacket. It was dark blue, almost black, thin leather with brown suede piping on the zipper pockets and shoulder seams. On the back was the Indian Motorcycle script lettering in the brown suede. We also added the lace-up vest, which had crisscross laces on the sides with right and left snap pockets with a snap front. We tried to develop new ideas all the time. I was still traveling with the Kemper to Europe for inspiration, and during one of these trips, we found a woman's jacket that could be developed into a perfect Indian Motorcycle speed jacket. A speed jacket is recognized by the stand-up racing band collar. It had a princess seam which formed a curved side panel that extended to the back. This panel could be done in a contrast color, and piping could be added to the seam to create dimension and a third color. One of the combinations we chose was a sky blue body with ecru/cream side panels and black piping. Then it was Indianized with labels and trims. This became another great body in the women's nylon outerwear collection. As usual, there were still counterfeiters. As I said before, it was a good thing because if nobody was copying you, it's a sign your products aren't that great. Unfortunately, it's the price you pay for owning a famous trademark. Regardless of this ongoing battle, we had a lot of great retailers, but one in particular that stood out was Latitude Fashion Retail, whose head office was in Vancouver. At their peak, they had about a dozen locations from Manitoba through British Columbia. The owner and president, Sam Perlman, would come to Toronto every now and again, and we'd go out on the town. He loved Indian Motorcycle, as his customers couldn't get enough of the product. After some time had passed, I still found myself thinking about Joish, wondering if I had just copped out and had not given it my best shot. I was 40 now and thought maybe doubts like this happened to everyone in my position. I decided to start communicating with her, and things were still sparking. Eventually, I moved from Chuck's into a 3-bedroom apartment on Avenue Road, just north of St. Clair Avenue. I fixed it up, and the next thing I know, I'm out of Chuck's and I'm living with Joish again. What can I say? I felt I had to try again for a third round. Well, you can only imagine, if it didn't work the first time going out, and it didn't work the second time after moving in together, was it going to work again? Joish was a great person. However, the same things as before kept happening, and after 3 weeks, I was gone. I left everything there as I couldn't bear to go back for it, especially after putting her through a third round that ended up not working out. Obviously, the answer to the affirmation question was a no, and I was back at Chuck's and thankful once again that I had a great friend that I could just show up and he'd take me in. I felt like an idiot, but this shit happens all the time. At least I didn't just stay there because I had gone to all that trouble. I got over it, and so did Joish. Life goes on, and I had to focus on all the positives. I always tried to be positive no matter what came at me. I would use my aphorism, shit happens, deal with it. This was true for every person. The trick is to snap out of it, which I became amazing at. Chapter 118. The first time I would have nightmares. It was the craziest thing. So much was happening at Indian on Wingold Avenue. It was amazing for me, and I loved it. Nevertheless, I do remember when I would have this recurring dream/nightmare. It was about the U.S. Indian motorcycle people taking over Indian Motorcycle Canada. The dream would start with me going to my office at 60 Wingold Avenue. The doors would be locked, and I'd try to look through the windows into my office. Only when I got there and looked in, it looked totally different. Then I would try and go around the back where I would actually get in. Once inside, there'd be a big wall separating the back area from the front, and I'd start banging on this wall like crazy. And at this point, I'd wake up and realize I was dreaming. That was definitely weird, and thankfully, it would eventually stop happening. However, it was obviously intense for me, as Indian Motorcycle was now my life, and I had expanded the brand far beyond just 4 t-shirts. I'm the one who drove the brand, creating the product, the designs, the atmosphere, and environment. I'd often run into somebody that would see me wearing Indian Motorcycle products, and they'd say, "Oh, I know the owner of Indian Motorcycle." I'd never let that bother me, as I knew who was the real owner/creator of Indian Motorcycle. Chapter 119. Indian Motorcycle participated in the 10th Fashion Cares event by sponsoring 2 ads in the program. We believed in supporting the community as they very much supported us. It was very exciting as we had new sales reps joining the team. The Western Territory was being handled out of Vancouver by Thompson Margolis, one of the city's largest high-end casual clothing sales agents. The new rep in the Maritimes was the Zach Rubin Agency of Halifax, one of the most established firms in the region. North and Eastern Ontario was now the responsibility of the highly respected Mark Silver out of Peterborough. The Montreal market was being handled by a young, hip agency called Rabibbo and Forte. Peter McCloskey, who had been with us since King Street, left in the summer and continued working in the clothing industry. Ken Georgopoulos joined us to handle Toronto sales. With this new team, we were set to maximize our sales nationally. Ken had worked as a salesman/buyer for MGM, which was a very good account for us in the Kitchener/Waterloo area. They had 4 retail outlets. Ken had been watching Indian Motorcycle from the beginning, when he would come to King Street and buy the brands that Montana River sold. He saw the potential of Indian Motorcycle and wanted to be part of it. We did have some sales in the US with our new rep, David Rhea, sales in Dallas. I'm just not sure how great sales were, nor how long they lasted. Chapter 120. I decided to try and be a bigger brother to my older brother. He had been to Club Med over 10 times, and I decided to go to one with him. We chose Jamaica. I always loved Jamaica, as I'd been there a few times. I even went once with the Greed Man and a couple guys, although I'd never been to Club Med before. I was quite intrigued as to what it would be like. When we first arrived, we were starving, and there were all kinds of nice places to get food at the resort. However, my brother insisted on having a hamburger. I tried to tell him that the beef wasn't always so good in Jamaica, but of course, he didn't listen. After we ate, we decided to go for a bike ride, and it didn't take too long before my brother was sick and in the bushes, puking his guts out on the side of the road. Most likely it was from the burger he had just devoured. Luckily, we flagged down a ride from someone with a van so we could take the bikes back. Not sure how long it took him to recover, and I imagined he was fine the next day. The best part was there was a lot of Americans there who could play hoops, though there was always a game going on. The problem was my back had been bothering me, so I'd taken some muscle relaxers with me in case I ran into back problems, which I eventually did as we were hooping so much. One day my back was really tight after playing a few hours straight, and I decided to take one pill, not realizing that you couldn't drink alcohol with it, and proceeded to go to dinner. They didn't serve beers in a can or bottle, so you had to go pour it into little plastic cups. Everyone carried 2 or 4 cups at a time back to the table, including me. After eating and having a couple cups of beer, I started to feel really sick. I was telling my brother, but he was talking to some girl and wasn't listening to me. Finally, I grabbed his arm and he told me to drink some water. The next thing I know, a nurse is slapping my face, repeatedly saying, "Do you know where you are? Do you know where you are?" I opened my eyes, saying in a very slurred voice, "Club Med." It should have been a commercial for Club Med. Apparently, I had passed out and puked all over myself and a little on my brother. He walked me back to the room with a girl he had met. I walked right into the shower with all my clothes on to get rid of any puke that was on me. After that, I felt completely better. I realized later that it was the combination of the alcohol and the muscle relaxant that made me ill. Either way, the contents of my stomach were gone, so no worries there. When my brother came back to check on me, I was sitting in my bed, boshing a hash joint. I think the trip was good for bonding as much as there possibly could be with him. It was definitely an experience I never forgot. Chapter 121. The Raptors were starting their second season, and they came to us to see if we'd sponsor them with our Indian motorcycle clothing. I couldn't believe it. I'd never seen a professional team wear anything other than outfits with their own name on it. I thought it was strange that they asked, but I guess being a new team in Toronto, they were a little green behind the ears. We immediately said yes. That was a real bonus for me, as I was able to see Indian motorcycle clothing on the court during NBA games. Even better was actually being there, hearing the announcers say, "Raptor Dancers clothing sponsored by Indian Motorcycle." I was really proud of that. I love taking my father and friends, including the Greed Band, to the games. Seeing the dancers come out in the woman's bomber jacket or the quilted vest was such an amazing experience, with everything looking perfect and sexy. Also, some of the Raptor players would come to our office and I would outfit them. I couldn't believe the sizing when I was measuring Marcus Camby for a jacket. He was 6'11", and when I measured his chest size, it was only 41 inches. That was smaller than mine, which was 42 inches. It was fantastic meeting the players, as most were really nice. but unfortunately not all. One time I asked Damon Stoudemire, who won Rookie of the Year the first Raptors season, to sign a basketball. I can't remember exactly what he said, but needless to say, he didn't sign the ball. The Raptors got off to a 3-3 start that year, then lost 6 straight, but won their last 2 games of the season, as they finished last place in the Central Division with a 30-52 record. This was a 9-game improvement over their inaugural season, but still there was a lot of growth to come to that young team. Sharon threw me a surprise 40th B-Day party at Shark City. She was always a great friend to me, and it was the first time that a birthday meant so much. It was the beginning of getting older, age-wise, and even though I'm a big believer that age is all still in your head, and that it's really just a state of mind, it still meant a lot. Chapter 122. Meanwhile, at Indian, the customers were demanding a more modern image to go along with the vintage product. So I worked with Jeff to create more modern Indian motorcycle logos, which would be used for prints, labels, embroideries, and patches that would go well with the new fabric in the modern collection. I was meeting with new companies to create new products all the time. Everyone wanted to be involved with Indian Motorcycle, which led to some great creative collaboration. We licensed Centennial Optical to make sunglasses. Unfortunately, even though they were super cool, the sell-through wasn't good enough to carry on for more than a few seasons. Morton Clark approached me as they had a Zippo license. I had always loved Zippo, which was usually the case with anything vintage. I dealt with one of the sons, Patrick. I only met him once in person when he was in Toronto, but that was enough to create a popular product, and we sold thousands of lighters with many different types of designs on them. Some were just printed black, some black and engraved, some just engraved. I had the back of some of my grommets filed down so I could mount them on the lighters too. I only remember the Scout 45 design being done in 3 colors, red, gold, and black, and it sold quite well. Another company approached me during this time, and the next thing I know, I found myself meeting with David Mr. Keys Belisario. His family owned Mr. Keys, which were kiosks and retail shops that were all over Canada in malls and shopping centers. They sold gifts, novelties, and souvenirs, and also duplicated keys. He understood the need for high quality, and we went on to create a line of classic-style wallets for men and women. They were made in black, and when it worked, we used contrast ecru/cream colored stitching. We'd expand the collection to include many other items such as business card holders, fanny packs, biker wallets, and even a day timer. He also made a huge number of various Indian Motorcycle pins and flasks with engraved logos. Although I already had Zippo, Mr. Keys had this amazing vintage-style replica of a windproof petrol lighter. I Indianized it with the Indian script logo and designed the packaging with him, and it looked great, and the retail price was only $15. We sold an incredible amount of his products the entire time he was supplying me. We have remained friends to this day. The collaborations continued to grow as I had used a buddy I knew that manufactured plastic lighting displays for fast food restaurants. He had the perfect product for me to use, a plastic oval-shaped globe type light. I created the artwork for him using the full headdress Indian logo. It was small above the large Indian script. Below that, on 3 lines, was the script, America's Pioneer Motorcycle. Then, since 1901, in all caps. The background was orange, and there was a thick black border. He made a sample for me, which was perfect for the retailers to display. I also made another one that just was in a cream color and had Indian Motorcycle since 1901. Another idea I came up with was after I had seen an engraved glass light. I knew immediately that this light would be a perfect medium for an Indian motorcycle display item. It was a piece of glass, 3/8 of an inch thick, that sat in a distressed black wooden stand, and the small light below the glass illuminated the engraving. It was beautiful. I found a company that could make the engraved glass. I also knew a small company that could make the stand with the light inserted inside, which would keep the cost down. I used the round original Indian motorcycle circle logo with the feather-faced Indian. It looked so cool and was also a great display item. As I'd had success with creating lighting, I decided to try and make a light using an Indian motorcycle fender light. It was still as beautiful as when I saw it for the first time at the cottage beside the Bluestones. Turns out that the small company that had made the stand out of wood could also create a stand using aluminum that was 3 inches wide and 1/4 inch thick and 10 inches long. It was a flattened curve slightly higher at the front, and the fender light sat perfectly in the middle, as if it was on the front fender of the bike. It was powder-coated light gray and used the same switch as the engraved glass light. I didn't make many because I knew it would only appeal to a few people. In retrospect, I think I was more intrigued by the challenge of creating it than making money selling them in bulk. I continued to be challenged and inspired by my work at Indian and kept striving to be the best I could be. Chapter 123. We had a policy that the Slymans and my family could get clothing for free, and we figured that nobody would abuse this generously provided privilege. However, after a while, I noticed my father was wearing so many different pieces that I had to stop him in the hall and confront him. I said, "Hey, I see you wearing so many different pieces of clothing. How do you pay for all that?" "I just put it on your account," he says. Once again, I was completely shocked. I went into the Slyman's office and said, "No more free clothing for our family members. If they want it, they can pay 10% above cost." Needless to say, I was pretty embarrassed. At least my father could have said thank you, or even my mother, who was also wearing so many pieces, but sadly that gratitude never came. My brother came into my office one day and pulled out a wallet he'd taken and said, "Hey, my credit cards don't fit in this wallet. I should get my money back." I didn't bother saying that he probably took the card holder, but rather said, "You didn't pay for it. Why would I give you your money back?" "Oh yeah, that's right," he says. What a creepy character. I tried not to take it too personally and just treat it as another incident to bounce off my armor and still be positive and always trying to remain cool. Yet it got to a point that I just couldn't ignore it any longer. I called my father into my office and said to him, "Listen, Yum, you're going to have to start respecting me a little more. I've achieved something that you have never even come close to doing." Then I sat down on the couch with him and started to tell him about my brother. I said, "You always ask where he gets his selfishness from. He gets it from you." I proceeded to give him many examples of things that he'd done, and when I finished, he said, "I'm glad we had this conversation. Let's go for something to eat." I don't think it affected him one bit, but I was proud of myself for at least having the balls to confront him. Family issues aside, a licensee for a new motorcycle in Japan came to us through the Slyman's travel agent. I didn't even want to know where they got the license from, but I figured it was from the bad man in the US. The company was Toyo International of Tokyo. I thought to myself, if you want us to make clothing for you, so be it. The Japanese consumers like to buy things from North America, as it was better than saying made in Japan. It was very interesting, as all sizing was so much smaller due to the Japanese people being generally smaller than North Americans. However, this reminded me of Jeff Lowe, the 6'4" Asian big man that I played with at George Brown College. Obviously, not all were small. As it turned out, it was good business and we did a garment wash program for them. Everything was long sleeved. Their artwork was quite good and I used some of it for our own collections. At this point, the Kemper was no longer freelancing and was designing silver jeans at Western Glove Works. This is what led them to approach us to make our denim. We launched a new line, with each style being named after vintage Indian motorcycles. The women's line included the Indian Ace, Indian 101, and the Silver Arrow. The men's names were Trailblazer and Roadmaster. They came in black, black blue, and 3 shades of indigo, and of course they all had the Indian motorcycle detailing. Chapter 124. Despite the promise of our denim line taking off, there were some red flags that popped up shortly thereafter. Sometime before the Christmas rush, Ken told me that one of our big customers, Urban Behavior, had called him on a weekend, which was troubling as we weren't open on the weekends. He said to Ken, "I'm coming by, so get in there and open up the warehouse." Ken said, "I don't know anything about this, and you better call and tell one of the owners to call me so I know it's cool." The Sly Man called Ken and said, "Open up and just write down everything he takes." Ken goes in and opens the warehouse and is waiting when all of a sudden 4 SUVs pull up and they start taking merchandise in garbage bags stuffed to the top, filling up all 4 SUVs. After speaking to Raj, I realized that the Sly Man had been discounting product to Urban Behavior before. That was not cool, and Ken had to deal with his big customers like Gene Machine's owner, Roy Perlman, calling Raj and reaming him out on the phone saying, "How can I compete with this guy? His pricing is so low." This had gone on many times before, as the Sly Man was in charge of sales. It was difficult for me to deal with that, as I was so immersed in the design of the product and creating new details and all the other tasks at hand. As previously mentioned, I never really felt comfortable with the Sly Man, but I had no choice. I had to continue with him. My sister moved to Kansas City, as once again, Danny had been given an offer he couldn't refuse. Although it was better than Winnipeg, that's for sure. I was still living with Chuck and still hooping with Ted Golka and the boys at Regina Pace's Collegiate, along with other workouts too. That was always a great escape, to get out there and be playing at a high level with great players. One day out of the blue, my friend Jody Yodels Sajay calls me up and asks me, "Fuss, can I go with Julie, the kosher Duts?" I replied, "Yodels, of course you can go out with her. I'm not going out with her. You don't have to ask me for permission." They hit it off, and she was a great influence on him in some ways, as she was very smart and very focused on reaching goals. This helped Yodels as he was trying to become a landscape architect and had flunked out twice before. Sure enough, the 3rd time was a charm with the kosher tuts by his side. He passed and was very proud of that accomplishment. I was so happy for them and invited them to the cottage, which was a great time for all of us. Yodels and the kosher tuts would eventually get married. Chapter 125. Back at Indian, Ken decided it was time to move on. He realized that he wanted to open up his own showroom and run his own business. I'm sure that the Sly Man had some influence in him leaving. I could relate to that, and I respected Ken for his decision. He went on to open a multi-brand showroom, working with premium, contemporary, and designer brands. We have remained friends ever since. Tammy Garland had been training, so to speak, with retailers in the province of Ontario and had been responsible for territory sales. She stepped up to replace Ken and was certainly ready for the challenge. I was still cruising out to all the usual spots, from Yorkville to College Street to Queen Street and even over to Ossington Avenue and Dundas Street. The scene was happening and I had a new feeling inside. I was always humble and never arrogant, unlike how I had been in my early hooping days when I would say things like, "You think you can stop me?" Then do a blow-by or stop on a dime for a 25-foot jumper just past the top of the key. Or I would give the beaties, which was staring at a teammate when they made a bad play. That came from my mother. When I would do something wrong, she would give me the beady eyes. I just wanted to make my teammates better and be a leader, and I think in those days I had to be like that. Yet now was different. I was much more experienced with people, and I had new traits that I had learned along the way. Respect, listening, and never being jealous. Being a good human being. Whomever I was talking to, someone younger or older, I would always listen and hear what they had to say. I would give advice to people even when I knew they weren't listening to what I was saying. Many times I would say to myself, I can't believe I just spent 25 minutes talking to that person. I knew they weren't even taking anything in and digesting it. I didn't care. I was just glad I had tried to pass on some knowledge that I had learned. Chapter 126. Things continued to roll along, as we were now involved with BMG Canada. A lot of the recording artists loved Indian Motorcycle. We co-sponsored the Tom Cochrane tour that had Amanda Marshall as the opening act. She'd come a long way since I'd seen her on the sidewalk in front of the Horseshoe Tavern. I dealt with her personally, so I could tell her how I'd seen her busking on Queen Street in front of one of my favorite bars. She picked out the unisex flight jacket, the one that was black/blue, leather with brown suede lettering on the back. In addition to athletes and movie stars, we also outfitted bands like Collective Soul, Smashing Pumpkins, the Philosopher Kings, Edwin, who was from I Mother Earth and had recently gone solo, Ace of Base, All for One, and Deborah Cox. I'd mount their posters on laminated blackboard, as I'd done with all the posters, and would hang them in the Indian cafe/kitchen. We were also involved in the Smashing Pumpkins cross-promotion between HMV, Much Music, and Virgin Records. We even managed to get some of our own stuff into the TV space. Talk show host Camilla Scott wore Indian Motorcycle, and we were on her show to promote it. Also, a lot of people at YTV wore Indian Motorcycle gear. Our exposure was amazing. At one point, I was asked to be on the cover of a new magazine called Page. Its tagline was, "It's about magazines." I liked it because it was about what I always said. You had to take in everything around you, and having a reference library was crucial. The cover title caption said, "The Room. Fuss Cooper rides magazines to tap hot new trends." This was true, and I believed in it. It was a fun shoot capturing the cover photo. They wanted to have my 1932 Indian Scout and me on the cover. After taking a bunch of shots, which I wasn't too keen on, I said, "Let me hold on to the handlebars and lay on my bike. You've got the big fan to make it look like I'm flying, right?" They took that shot, and while they were doing it, they threw magazines at me. That was the shot for the final cover, so it was even sweeter for me knowing that I'd contributed to the first issue. I wasn't just some dummy in the picture. Chapter 127. Meanwhile, as the Indian brand continued to thrive, the 2 years were up on the Sly Man's investment loan, and I asked him for the money he owed me. As you'll recall, I loaned him $250,000 to be equal partners in the company. He said to me, "You better go speak to my father." Oh, fuck. I thought to myself, why would he say something like that? I thought it was totally weird, but I guess it was normal for him to do something like that. I walked down the street to his father's office, went inside, and asked if I could speak to him. He waved me into his office and told me to take a seat. I did and said, "Hey, it's time for your son to pay me the money I loaned him 2 years ago to be equal partners. He told me to come and ask you." "Fuss, listen, I can't believe what you've done for my son. I would never have done anything like that. As far as getting any money, it won't be from me," he replied. There it was. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And just like that, I own 60% of Indian Motorcycle. Having such a weird relationship with the Sly Man, I was very interested when Chuck from Wing Sun Garments, my favorite manufacturer, came to us with interest in becoming part owner of our company. He loved Indian Motorcycle and wanted to be more than just a manufacturer for us. We went to a meeting in his office and he offered us $1 million for a third of the company. I've got to tell you that it all happened so fast, and all I remember was the Sly Man insulting Chuck, who then totally freaked out. I walked out of that meeting with my head spinning, saying, "Well, I guess we can't use him anymore." In hindsight, years later, I would realize that the Sly Man had purposely kiboshed that meeting. Jack wanted a third of our company, and since I owned 60% at that time, that meant the Sly Man would have been a minority shareholder, and there was no way he was going to let that happen. Chapter 128. After losing our best manufacturer, it was the Sly Man's idea to go to Leslie Shuchuk and propose a deal where she would consult for us and we would take her workers and everything she had into our warehouse. I thought it was a great idea as I respected her design capabilities. This would take the responsibility off her by assuming all the payables such as rent and salaries. She agreed, and the next thing I knew, we had production going on in the back and 5 or 6 more employees. Of course, we had our regular suppliers as well, except for my favorite, that is. Shit happens, you have to keep on rolling. I noticed that Leslie would only come into the office periodically. I totally understood why, because after working for herself for so long, designing and manufacturing her own products, it would be difficult for her to feel the same gratification in making our product. Having recognized this situation, we mutually decided and agreed upon a dollar figure, and we both went our separate ways. Having the team in the back making patterns and production runs of new products was very convenient. However, it never made up for the loss of Wing Sun Garments, our best manufacturer, and it would lead to further problems down the road. Shortly after this, the Sly Man found some manufacturer in India. I was meeting with a gentleman who was the rep for the company, and I was very unsure of him. He would say "actually" every 20 seconds. It was actually driving me fucking nuts. After receiving the product from India, I came to the conclusion that it looked good. However, it wasn't up to our quality standards. When I washed a few shirts, I found the shrinking and torquing, which is twisting, to be excessive. I was embarrassed as we had already shipped the product to our customers. Thankfully, there didn't seem to be any complaints. Nevertheless, I made sure we never used that company again. Chapter 129. I was still living at Chuck's and having a ball, going to the Orbit Room in particular, but also cruising to the cottage with friends, tossing the bee and water skiing or whatever. Having the boat was totally amazing for me, although I was getting tired of keeping it at the marina, having nowhere else to keep it. I'd be hanging with Jill and Lilish and the usual cottage peeps. Sometimes I'd stay over for bonfires singing songs, but mostly I'd head back to the city and go out to see live music or go to parties that were being thrown that I didn't want to miss. I found a new spot on the Danforth called Myth. They had beautiful pool tables and the place had a very cool vibe. I especially noticed the outfits the servers wore, specifically their velvet-fitted vests. I met the designer that was responsible for them, a fellow by the name of Dragon Drago Vuko. He was a technical pattern maker. We'd always run into each other in the future, and he'd be working at places like Club Monaco, Abercrombie and Finch, Joe Fresh, alongside Joe Mimram. We are still friends to this day. The owners, John Samaras and Jimmy Sargalo, and I would become good friends, and they'd eventually open many other establishments in downtown Toronto. College Street was still the hottest place to hang out and see live music. My favorite area was the strip between Bathurst Street and Dovercourt. I loved to eat at Coca-Lazzoni, and there were always new places for live music being added to the list, such as Bar Italia, College Street Bar, in addition to the Orbit Room, which was still my favorite. Lava Lounge, which was opened by two guys who had worked at the Rivoli and Queen Mother on Queen Street, were also good food spots. I didn't frequent either of them very often, but the Rivoli did have pool tables upstairs. Amy Winehouse played pool there at the Rivoli after she played her first show in Toronto. I know I've said it before, but there was nothing better than seeing live music in a small bar with great sound system. Quality musicians performing their craft, whether it was with their voice or instrument, was so amazing. To witness the expression in a person was exciting, whether it was someone wailing away in a solo on their instrument, or hearing the power, range, and control of their voice, or the incredible rhythm they had together as a band, creating a unique sound no matter what song they were playing. I always managed to find a great live performance to evoke strong emotions in me, to the point where I'd turn to the person I was with and exclaim, "Whoa, that was fucking amazing!" And you couldn't beat the scene anywhere else in the city. You could walk up and down the stretch of College Street and be surrounded by all types of hip people. Sometimes I would be inspired by some of the clothing I'd see and apply it to my designs. Chapter 130. My sister would come and visit with the kids, and I'd take them out on the boat for skiing and crazy tubing rides. After, we'd always go to the Shallows, where we'd toss the bee or tennis ball. I loved spending time with them, as it reminded me of the old days. We wouldn't head back to the cottage until the day was done. Then I'd BBQ with whatever meats I'd brought up from the city. It was always a feast of entrees like ribeye or New York steaks, burgers and hot dogs, veal chops, chicken and ribs or wings. My mother took care of all the side dishes. After dinner, I'd always be stuffed, saying, "Why did I eat so much?" I try to do as little as that as possible these days. If my sister weren't visiting, I'd usually head back to the city to go out and party with my buddies. When the weather was nice, I loved blading through the city, whether it was down at the beaches or through the streets near where I lived. Hooping was year-round, and I took full advantage of that. I was always about staying in shape, being active, and getting that workout high, along with that other kind of buzz. I was always about being active, enjoying life, and always trying to keep the positive vibes flowing. Chapter 131. Jeff Eisen and I were always working on new posters, and we did this particular one that was 5 feet high by 4 feet wide. It had a black background with a vertical rectangular shot of the front part of a 48 Chief, starting from the front forks, showing the headlight and the famous skirted fender in black and white. There was a chrome beveled border around it, and centered 1 inch above the border was a chrome beveled Indian Motorcycle logo. Below the border was the chrome beveled tagline in caps, "Wear a piece of American history." It was beautiful, and the customers loved it, so much so they wanted copies to sell. We also did one that was 33 inches high and 5 feet wide. It featured a shot with a bluish tinge to it of the classic front Indian fender light. At the top it said, "The Legend Returns," and below it said, "1999 limited edition Chief." It was another big hit. Chapter 132. An opportunity arose for a new potential licensee. I called him the Pretender. He was presenting us with the opportunity to create the Indian Brewing Company. I worked on the logo, having coasters done. The first label that we'd use for the first type of beer was called Big Chief Legendary Lager. Once this started to happen, it led to the idea of a microbrewery. This was the beginning of us looking for a location in downtown Toronto. We had meetings with Maury Kalin, the owner of Mr. Green Jeans, as well as Richard Gataya, the owner of Montana, a rocking bar that I went to quite a few times. Therefore, I already knew Richard. He was the one who showed us the location at King and Peter. I had been inspired by Mr. Green Jeans the first time I saw it when I went out for lunch with Sharon Ungerman way back in her George Brown days. After the first meeting, we decided we weren't interested in pursuing business with these two any further, although we did love the space. Nevertheless, we continued meeting with the Pretender, who was supposed to raise money for Indian Motorcycle, as unfortunately things were not going well for us financially. I never felt a good vibe from the Pretender. Then he brought in Murray Smith, who I thought was a very interesting, business-like character, and someone else I'd referred to as the con man, a guy that would pull the wool over my eyes, not to mention many others. I didn't know it at the time, but he would eventually be the downfall of Indian Motorcycle for us. The Pretender had brought in his cousin, who was a stockbroker, and he too was trying to help with our money problems with the bank. He met with Murray, who was an amazingly fast talker and problem solver, and Raj, the controller. The cousin, not finding any solutions to our problems with the bank, gave up and left. Yet the Pretender saw that we were really struggling and proposed a deal where he would raise $3 million or something to that effect. This was not a good deal for me, but I was so stressed about our bad financial situation that I signed it. The Pretender had a week to deposit $300,000 into the account or the deal was off. This was a seriously crucial point in my career, and I couldn't take the pressure. Once I had signed the deal, I realized it was the worst mistake I made in my life. I decided I had to get away and went to stay at my parents' condo in Florida. Every day the Pretender would call to speak to me, and I would tell my father, "Tell him I'm not here." There was no way I was going to speak to him. Each day it was the same thing, until finally on the Friday that he was due to make the deposit, I called Raj at the end of the day, and thankfully he told me, "Fuss, the Pretender has not made the deposit." I can't express how amazing I felt. I had just dodged a serious bullet. I was elated. I went to my room, got on my knees, shut my eyes, and I think I even shed a few tears. I came back to Toronto, and on Monday I walked into my office with a new perspective. I now had Murray Smith, who I really felt confident in taking the reins. He came into my office and told me, "The Pretender wants to have a meeting with you." "What do you mean, Murray? The guy didn't deposit the money. The deal is off." "He just wants to talk to you," Murray continued. I thought to myself, this guy who walked around Indian Motorcycle like he owned the place. I mean, I'd see him with his feet up on the table in our boardroom. He'd prance around like a big shot. I wasn't that kind of a guy, yet I said, "Okay, tell him to meet me in the boardroom." I walked in, and there was Murray, along with my partner, the Sly Man, on one side of the table. I sat on the other side. The Pretender was at the head of the table, and I swear, he looked like he was going to cry. I didn't say anything smug. I just stood up and said to him, "Hey, listen, man, you didn't put the money in the bank. The deal is off. Good luck." I stood up, reached out, and shook his hand and left. Chapter 133. Shortly thereafter, Murray restructured our company. where I was the largest shareholder with 2 million shares. Murray owned 1.5 million shares, and the rest were distributed accordingly. He began to move very fast, and things started improving. This took so much pressure off me, meaning I no longer had to worry about our money problems. In the meantime, I took another shot at the Fongatola, who was so cute and so nice and so organized. Working with her day in and day out, I just couldn't help myself. It was kind of weird going to her apartment that used to be my old place. However, I was totally happy that she lived there. We were having some great times. How could we not? I took her to San Francisco, where we stayed at the W Hotel, and we visited my buddy Captain Z and his wife Susan, going out for lunch and dinners, visiting Fisherman's Wharf and those crazy sea lions. I loved wildlife. Sadly, Fongatola and I only lasted for a short time, as usual, and I was starting to realize that I might be destined to be a bachelor forever. Fong and I have remained very good friends to this day, and I am totally grateful for that. Chapter 134. The Toronto Raptors were going to start their third season, and the Raptors dance pack approached us and asked if we wanted to pay $50,000 for them to wear our clothing again. I told them, hey you guys, it's been great, but you should be wearing your own clothing that says Raptors. Having them wear our clothing for the 96-97 season had been an amazing experience that I will never forget, and at the same time never really understand how we were able to get that opportunity. I continued going to games with friends and peeps that appreciated the great seats I had. At some point in 1997, Philip Zangi, who had a previous claim on the Indian trademark, gets convicted of securities fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. Chapter 135. It was time to go on a second vacation with my brother. This time it was to Cancun, and of course it was Club Med. It was nice, and I think we must have hooped there. I know I was excited when we went deep sea fishing, and then I was bummed when it was not what I thought it would be. It was everything that you think, except that when I finally had a fish on the line, there was no fight. It was like the fish was buzzed or something. When I reeled it into the boat, it was a huge sailfish, and I couldn't understand how there had been no fight. I'd always heard how great it was to reel in a sailfish. Oh well. My brother had met a girl from Switzerland, and she seemed nice. He said to me shortly after meeting her, hey, she's into you. Are you into her? Because if not, I'm going for it. Go ahead, man. I'm totally not into her, I replied. Next thing I know, he brought her back to our room. What could I do? The beds were only 3 feet apart, so I just rolled over and tried not to think about it. After the trip, he started seeing her long distance, and it became serious. Go figure. Chapter 136. Once again, things were really happening with Indian Motorcycle in the U.S., and a trustee had been appointed, Sterling Consulting Corporation. This company, which was headed by Rick Block, wanted to put all the alleged owners of the Indian brand together in the U.S. He came to us and offered to buy our company for $3 million. Murray and I decided that we wouldn't sell, as our game plan was to buy the American trademark and all the other countries that came with it when the time came for it to be up for auction. This would lead to us making the first Indian motorcycle prototype. Murray was an extraordinary person with a drive like no other I had ever come across. He would sit with me and talk about awe-inspiring plans. The first being, we have to make a bike. Enter the California Motorcycle Company, CMC, which was based in Gilroy, California, also known as the garlic capital of the world. They have a garlic festival every year featuring various garlicky foods such as garlic ice cream, if you can believe that. I had no objections, and I loved to watch him do his thing. I can honestly say that Murray coming to me was a blessing. I remember saying to myself, here's this guy wearing pleated pants and an old man shawl collared sweater. At least the color was ecru/cream. He was really taking the bull by the horns, dealing with suppliers and our payables, striking deals to clear debts. The con man had befriended me from the first day I'd met him. Of course, I had no idea what he was at the time. The pretender was gone, and the Indian Motorcycle Brewing Company idea was a thing of the past. However, we decided to go ahead with the location on King Street for the future Indian Motorcycle Cafe and Lounge. This was the name we had chosen after much deliberation. The Indian Cafe red neon sign above the entrance to the kitchen and our offices had a lot of influence on us choosing that particular name. Chapter 137. I'll never forget the day that we had to go to Ed Mirvish's office. It was in Honest Ed's, which opened in 1948, located right at the corner of Bloor Street and Bathurst Street. We entered through the side door on Bathurst, going up a staircase where the walls were plastered with pictures of Ed with celebrities from all walks of life. This was a true legend of Toronto, who had many thriving businesses in the city and owned a huge assortment of properties in downtown core, including the Royal Alexandra Theatre and the Princess of Wales Theatre, which he built. He was a super nice man with an incredible character. I remember walking into his office where the plastering of pictures continued, and there was a long boardroom table where everyone took their seats. He was at one end, and I was at the other. I couldn't help spreading my arms wide and saying, "What's happening, Ed?" I was known for always greeting people by saying, "What's happening?" He just laughed, and we signed a 5-year lease for the whole building. The historic Westinghouse building was built in the 1920s with the reddish gold brick and cream terracotta accentuations of the 1920s factory loft. It was an expensive space consisting of 6 floors. Ironically, in 1912, the Hendy Manufacturing Company's Canadian branch established a new 18,000 square foot 4-story brick factory in Toronto at 12 to 14 Mercer Street. It was said to be capable of producing 5,000 motorcycles a year to supply the 150 Indian dealers across Canada and the British Empire export markets. After World War I, it was phased out. The Indian Cafe was going to happen, and it was 100 yards from where there had once been an Indian motorcycle factory. How fitting was that? I was so excited as I was finally going to be able to sink my teeth into something that was going to encompass every skill that I had tuned and sharpened, plus expand my skills into many other aspects of design. All good things eventually come to an end, as the time came when the Fongatola was ready to leave. The longest she had stayed at one job prior to Indian Motorcycle was 3 years, and I was grateful that she had spent 4 years with us. She eventually had a daughter, Chloe, whose middle name was Jet. We stayed in touch, and I'm so fortunate that we are great friends today. The Jet is now a teenager, learning to drive, and taller than the Fongatola. It's really hard to keep those great friendships going, and the older I get, the more I see them slipping through my fingers. Somehow we hooked up with Lori Yonder, a terrific salesperson who wanted to do Indian motorcycle golf. I called her Golf Girl. We created a small collection with the brand name Indian Motorcycle Golfwear, which consisted of things like caps and golf shirts, a golf bag with a small towel attached for cleaning balls and clubs, and a golf umbrella. Along with the collection, we also created a large beach towel. Of course, everything was Indianized. We promoted the collection with printed materials such as posters and postcards, as well as a hang tag incorporating an original image of a couple beside an Indian motorcycle with sidecar at a golf course with club in hand. Chapter 138. One of Murray's ideas was announced to me when I saw a large Winnebago pull up into the driveway beside ours. His idea was to cover it with Indian Motorcycle in some way and use it to promote the brand. Vehicle wraps had come a long way, and it was an exciting project. Jeff and I discussed what graphics we would use. At this point, I let Jeff deal with all the information required for the company that was doing the wrap. Of course, the famous Red Indian Chief in the Field scene that I had used so often was once again put to good use. The scene covered the back half, and then it merged to black for the front half, where the Indian Motorcycle logo appeared. It was definitely unmistakable and sure to draw attention. Now the cafe at 355 King Street was in motion. We needed more bikes than just my 1932 Indian Scout, and we needed more memorabilia as well. This guy I knew, who was into Indian motorcycles and other vintage bikes, came into the picture. I guess he met with Murray because the next thing I knew, he was going on a trip to look for a few old Indian motorcycles and memorabilia. To our great surprise, when the guy came back, he called us and told us he had 3 bikes and some memorabilia. He brought the Winnebago back to our office and gave me the memorabilia that he had bought. To my disappointment, I discovered he had only visited the one collector I had told him about, which was, of course, David Wasserman. I asked him, "Didn't you see anyone else?" I can't remember what he replied, but the response was underwhelming to be sure. The next thing he told us was he wanted to restore the 3 bikes and sell them to us, at which point Murray freaked out on the guy and told him, "It's our money you used to buy the bikes, and now you want to sell them to us?" In the end, we got the bikes back without being restored, and that guy from that point on in my life became known as the Sleaze Man. We would eventually find another driver for the Winnebago, and his name was Adam Turner. Chapter 139. Meanwhile, through a label company we used, we got a call about a certain Indian motorcycle label in production. This was how we found out that Czech, the owner of Winged Sun Garments, was doing an Indian motorcycle line of clothing and denim. The label company called us as they thought the label was for us and wanted some info about quantities. Upon further investigation, we found out that it was Winged Sun Garments, and we told them to give us all the labels and not produce anything for anyone, as we own the trademark for Canada. As it turns out, Winged Sun Garments had purchased a license from someone in the U.S. that supposedly had some rights. This, however, was for the U.S. only. Winged Sun Garments could get away with this by making the product here in Canada with no Indian motorcycle details on it, and then send it to the U.S. and detail it there. We also found out that the production assistant from when I was on King Street, who I got a job for at the Incredible Clothing Company, was working there. It would have been a nice gesture to get a heads up from her. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. I respected Czech as a great manufacturer who had grown to appreciate the brand I had created. I knew that he had probably spent a lot of money, and I feared that it would be all for nothing. Chapter 140. Meanwhile, on 355 King Street West, the con man was in charge of the cafe's build-out, and the first thing to do was to apply for permits and get all 6 floors clean. This meant drywalled, painting, and lighting installed. We also had to box out the elevator to separate entrances to all floors. The plan was to rent the 5th and 6th floors. The 4th floor was to be our offices, and we could also rent out office space there as well. The cafe was going to be on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd floors, so we chose to use hardwood floors for the first 4 floors. Whoever rented the 5th and 6th would be responsible for their own floors, which they would probably use carpet. While things progressed on the cafe at 60 Wingold Avenue, I was always creating, designing, and coming up with new products. My friend Herb Moore had finally sold Chenille Crest, and I was happy for him, as he was getting up there in age and really wanted to get out of the business. We still kept in touch. The new owner was fine. I mostly dealt with a girl who worked there and did all the digitizing for the designs. Her name was Lana Polanski, and I like working with her, so much so that I still do today. However, John Brown from Johnny B. Goods had completely disappeared. I seriously had no idea where he went. Nevertheless, I had to find a new belt maker, which thankfully I did in the fashion district. The name of the company was Delta Leather Products, owned by a talented and interesting fellow by the name of Stephen Chesley. This turned out to be a blessing and a great fit. Not only could he make all the belts I was making with Johnny B. Goods, but he also made a variety of different styles of bags. Everything was incredible and high quality. We developed knapsacks, purses, duffel bags, toiletry bags, and a great over-the-shoulder women's bag. All in all, the collection consisted of 17 pieces. Furthermore, while dealing with Delta, I met MJ, who was a salesperson there. She loved Indian Motorcycle and eventually came to work for me. We had great success with her selling the leather bags. Chapter 141. During this time, work on the Indian Chief prototype was progressing well, and I needed to create/design the artwork for the clutch cover, which had to fit into a circle. I used a sans serif type Indian Motorcycle Co. curved on the upper and lower parts. In the middle, I used the Indian script straight across. All the artwork was to be engraved. Another prominent piece was the carburetor/air cleaner cover. This was like an ornament, so it had to be something special. It came to me immediately because of the shape. The Indian headdress was the obvious choice. I said to Jeff, we need to take this design and stylize it to make it very clean, and it has to be in one color, so it will be easy to emboss. After a few attempts, we had the design and it fit perfectly. I also consulted on a few other areas where it would just involve Indian script. Chapter 142. Eventually it was time for me to meet with the design company for our project, officially titled the Indian Motorcycle Cafe and Lounge. The con man had chosen 2x4 design. I had to chuckle inside from the last time I was at Shark City and remembering their less than stellar design of the drink rail. However, I welcomed the opportunity to work with them, as I had never done a project of this complexity before. I gave them a lot of the same input as I had done at 60 Wingold Avenue, plus a lot more. I added in things like rubber, influenced by the footboards of a motorcycle. I could see myself standing at the bar with my foot on a black rubber foot rail. I also suggested frosted glass, as I loved the way the glass light I'd created and design turned out. I'd seen frosted glass in some of the newer concepts, and it was definitely a modern/vintage look and feel. I also really emphasized the use of stainless steel throughout. What is more, I wanted backlit signage behind the bars, and of course the famous Red Indian Chief in the field scene would be perfect. I also had a stunning vintage picture I'd been given from one of my printers. It was an early 1906 Indian motorcycle with flowers lying across the tank in front of a gorgeous backdrop. It was amazing working with 2x4, as the company had come a long way since Shark City. It took quite a few meetings, and then it was time to let them do the drawings for fixtures and suggest treatments that we should use. Chapter 143. Back at 60 Wingold Avenue, Murray's prime objective was raising money to pay off the bank loan. That was where my old buddy John Albright came into the picture. I called him Johnny A. His company, J.L. Albright Venture Partners, Inc., started by investing $3.5 million with us. Then he and Murray went to other venture capitals to raise more money for the Indian Chief prototype. This was also to pay for our marketing plan, the cafe, the expansion of the clothing line, and a public relations campaign using John McKay Communications. We were really moving. Murray was an exceptional promoter/businessman. Johnny A. gave a few others and me a Galois 1/10 scale model of a 1948 Indian Chief motorcycle. It was to celebrate the achievement of raising the money. On the back fender, there was a decal that said, $50 million raised, J.L. Albright Venture Partners, Inc. Galois made the most amazing Indian motorcycle models, and we would eventually find the distributors and start selling them. My father, who had also received some shares, came to Raj and me before we went to the U.S. to raise more money. He suggested that we increase his salary from $24,000 to $40,000, and he said they will never know the difference. That really shocked me. Shortly afterwards, he was let go, although his suggestion had nothing to do with that decision. Years later, he denied ever getting paid a salary, and also that he had suggested raising it to $40,000. Nevertheless, we went on to raise more money in the U.S. to plan for the acquisition of the Indian motorcycle trademark, and the PR campaign was in full force. All the while, I remained focused on what I was doing. Around this time, I met Kevin Woolham, who was one of the guys who had come from an interview with Murray. He was hired to be part of the Indian motorcycle sales team. We became friends, and we'd go out to clubs after work. He'd always say to me, "I got dance moves, man." I didn't believe it, because looking at him, you'd never think it was in him. He told me he'd been one of the male go-go dancers wearing sparkly gold shorts at RPM, dancing in one of the cages that were suspended over and around the huge dance floor. The fact that I had gone there for almost every psychedelic Monday was an interesting coincidence. He also went to Gilroy a few times, as he was involved in the sales of the bike. Chapter 144. As far as my boshing days were concerned, a friend of mine had given me a joint of this new type of weed people were smoking. I went home and only had a couple tokes and got so wasted that I called my friend who gave it to me and said, "Hey man, I think there's PCP in this. You might have to take me to the hospital." I didn't realize that it was the beginning of hydroponic weed and the crazy, stupid, powerful buzz you'd get from it. After an hour, I wasn't as buzzed and felt okay, although I vowed never to smoke any weed that wasn't like my Jamaican Sensi. I also smoked high-quality hash. Things in the Bosch world were really going to change, although I had no idea to what degree that change would be. Thankfully, I was still hooping with Ted and the boys, which played a huge role in getting my mind off the intense day-to-day creative process. Also, going to the cottage was always key in that department as well. I don't think that I could ever imagine not spending my summer days on Lake Simcoe. It was my happy place and helped me decompress from the daily grind. I had been telling my parents for 2 summers to go take a look at my friend Lumpy's cottage. It was very close to us, and it had been listed for sale for a few years without finding a buyer. The listing had started around $900,000 and had been steadily going down every year, and was at $340,000 when my father finally said, "We're going to look at the cottage." Fortunately, he purchased it, and we took possession that fall. It needed a small amount of work done, but we were in there by the next summer. Buying that cottage was the best thing he ever could have done. Of course, years later, he would never acknowledge the fact that I had pestered him for 2 straight summers to go and look at it. Chapter 145. Creatively, I was thriving and was really getting into the modern/vintage visualization of what the cafe was going to look like. I went on the hunt for memorabilia as I knew it would be displayed throughout the entire venue, starting with the first and second floors. I acquired Indian motorcycle brochures, magazines, trophies, pendants, tools, pins, parts, and even the boxes they came in. I bought an old rusty Power Plus motor. I even found an Indian motorcycle bicycle from the 1920s. It had rubber wheels in wooden frames. I kept it in my office behind my desk as it was a great conversation piece. I already had all kinds of black and white posters at our offices that would be hung throughout, but was always keeping my eyes open for more. I worked with Legacy Leathers owner James Jimmy Ward, who was the nicest guy, and his demand for high quality was the same as mine. We worked on the lounge chairs, and I wanted the side arms to resemble the Indian motorcycle skirted fender. They were going to be in butterscotch with black piping, as well as black with gray piping on the side following the line of the arm. This would resemble the way the Indian motorcycle fender is kind of split and is more noticeable when the fender is two-tone. Back at the office, Jeff and I were working on the design of the outside signage. I wanted a modern/vintage look to it, and we came up with a sort of dinerish look. The back would be stainless steel, curved at both ends to give it that three-dimensional look, with 4 raised stainless steel bands horizontally across. Flushed against it would be the Indian script above motorcycle, which was Futura bold in all caps and a little longer so the script sat nicely above. The lettering was around 6 inches thick, and the sides were ecru cream to match the face of the lettering that lit up. Below that, and much smaller, was pinned off raised lettering, Cafe and Lounge, in Futura bold in caps in black plexiglass. The entrance was diagonally cut so you could enter from west side off Peter Street or north side off King Street. This meant there would be 2 signs. The outside of the building was coming along. Meanwhile, the interior of the cafe entrance had stairs on both sides with stainless steel railings and handrails. This led to the huge glass doors with aluminum mullions to look like each door had 4 large glass panes. They were inset in the glass wall, which had the same effect as the doors, but the panes of glass were much larger. The window treatment continued for the retail store facing north with a 3-foot double-sided round sign. It had ecru and cream plexiglass faces wrapped in stainless steel. Printed on both sides in black was the round Indian motorcycle logo with the feather-faced Indian head in the center with type that read Indian Motorcycle on the top and Clothing Company on the bottom. On the other side was the entrance to the offices, and beside that was the patio garage door. This matched the aluminum mullion look and also had a stainless steel railing where part of it was a gate to enter in and out, since there would be an outside patio too. The larger windows throughout the front of the building gave it a showroom type look. There was 7-inch high and 2-inch thick pinned off ecru cream lettering similar to the above mentioned style of the outside north side of the building. Sales and service was above the patio garage, and offices was above the building entrance. Clothing Co. was above the retail store. On the west side of the building was the same lettering. This lettering had the feel of the Westinghouse building and the timeless lettering that was already on its construction and attained that specific look we were going for. Chapter 146. After Fong had left the Wingold Avenue offices, the first person we tried to replace her with didn't work as well as we'd hoped. Consequently, the Sly Man came to me to discuss hiring a former employee of his from Montana River, to be our production manager. For the past few years, she'd been working at Club Monaco. Against my better judgment, I allowed him to talk me into hiring her. The name that I would use for her was Greasy Girl, as the name fit her appearance and character. While I was working on the new fall collection, I was surprised to find items in the showroom that I'd had nothing to do with. They were pieces that I thought were completely out of place in an Indian motorcycle collection. I realized at that point that the Sly Man was working with Greasy Girl to create his own line. I expressed my concerns to Murray, asking him, "Did you see what's going on in the showroom? There are pieces in there that look like they belong in Club Monaco." I couldn't believe that this was happening to me. It was the ego man all over again. The situation would eventually come to a head when I was bringing back some embroidered samples on a rolling rack, and Greasy Girl commented to me, "You're ruining the line." After which I went into my office and thought to myself, what the fuck was that? I then turned around and went to Greasy Girl and said in a loud voice, "You fucking work for me, and you're fucking fired. Get the fuck out." I don't think I'd ever told anyone to fuck off in that way before, but needless to say, that was the end of Greasy Girl at Indian. Chapter 147. I'll never forget the day when Murray rode the first Indian motorcycle prototype up Wingold Avenue. I stood on our front steps with my heart pounding as it roared by. It was yellow and white and was loud as hell, as Murray was really ripping it when he drove by. I thought to myself, there it is, man. The Indian motorcycle is back, and that's what I'm going to be riding. Regardless of my sheer excitement at seeing the prototype, there were still things that had to be adjusted. For example, the fenders were way too fat, but overall it looked fantastic. Another thought came into my head. Murray Bluestone would be rolling in his grave if he knew that it was the kid that had a cottage beside him who played a huge role in bringing back the Indian motorcycle. Chapter 148. Nevertheless, work continued to progress at the cafe, and 2x4 had come up with some great elements. For example, placing recessed lights in the ceiling of the entrance/lobby. The foyer walls were painted ecru/cream, and the ceiling was painted white, which contrasted with all of the others that were painted charcoal. On the left was the retail store, marked by pinned-off stainless steel-looking letters that said Clothing Co. On the opposite wall was a picture of Hendy Manufacturing Company, the makers of Indian motorcycles in Springfield, Mass. It was mounted in a stainless steel frame. Inside the planked wood ceiling was ecru cream, and the beams were charcoal. We used maple, stainless steel, and black laminate throughout. Moreover, the ceiling was lit with black track lighting with halogen lights. I designed a 2.5 by 2.5 rectangular chrome-like plaque with an embossed Indian motorcycle logo to brand various items throughout the cafe, such as displays and tables or anything I thought worth Indianizing. We also found interesting ways to display our products. For example, the retail sales counter was originally just black laminate. However, I thought it needed something more and added a stainless steel face featuring an etched Indian motorcycle script logo that had an 8-inch ledge, which we used to display items like our amazing windproof petrol lighter in an easel display. Pretty much anything that we wanted to highlight and would fit, we put there. Cigars were very popular at the time, if you can believe that, which led to the installment of a black stained wooden humidor. Beside the humidor was a display case used to showcase various items, such as Zippo lighters, sunglasses, and genuine Indian motorcycle jewelry. Along the glass mullion wall separating the retail store from the cafe were black laminate framed fixtures that were secured to the floor and the ceiling with stainless steel bars. This gave the impression that it was floating. What is more, there was maple shelving to display folded items, or stainless steel bars could be inserted to display hanging items. This allowed customers in the cafe to have a clear view of the interior of the retail store. Almost all of the retail fixtures that were designed by 2x4 were made by Seven Continents, Kenny Albright's company. We honored the pioneers of Indian Motorcycle Company by placing a couple of large stainless steel framed pictures of the original founders, George Henry and Carl Oscar Hedstrom, on the walls of either side of the cafe and lounge entrance. Inlaid in the charcoal linoleum floor was a double-circled Indian headdress logo in 3 colors. We used different colored triangles to show the way, the same as we had done at 60 Wingold Avenue. On the right were huge mullion windows and a very long black leather banquette encased in a maple frame, which had small stainless steel triangles inset the arms at both ends. I even used the domed Indian motorcycle headdress buttons on the back sections to create a tufted look. On the left, as mentioned, there were great views of the retail store. Straight ahead from there was an oval-shaped, diamond-cut top maple platform for displaying motorcycles, which I would eventually put to good use. Above that was an oval-shaped lighting fixture with adjustable lights. It looked so cool and was a great way to display the motorcycles. Behind this was a backlit display unit with 9 recessed square shelves, each with a cream-colored plexiglass backing, also lit from behind. This was excellent for displaying items and the perfect backdrop behind the motorcycle. Just before entering the dining room, there was a plasma screen playing a loop DVD created by Jeff Eisen. This consisted of rare, old photos of Indian motorcycle history, such as shots of riders and different bikes, among other things. It also advertised specials from the restaurant and clothing products from the retail store. The plasma screen was the best thing that the con man would contribute. Being the brand guardian, everything was subject to my approval. Throughout the building, we painted all the walls, planked wood 12-foot ceilings, and ventilation pipes ecru/cream, and all the beams and pillars charcoal. The freight elevator was in the middle of the west side of the building on all floors. This made it easy to load off of Peter Street once we got going. The scene was more than I could have hoped for. To the left of the main entrance was the first floor bar, which was made of maple and angled outward at both ends. On the front below the counter were 4 pinned off 1-inch thick 4 by 3 feet stainless steel wrap pieces with the etched double-circled Indian headdress logo framed with heavy bolts. Right in front of them, on the floor, running the length of the panels, were 4 stainless steel foot rails with rubber inserts, just as I had envisioned. In front of the bar were black lacquered high-back wooden stools. I didn't like the idea from 2x4 of using cow skin in the seating, so we stuck with wood. We served a wide variety of beer on tap, and the combination of chrome, candle lighting, and fresh-cut flowers helped create a nice ambiance. I branded all glassware with a wide variety of Indian motorcycle logos using gold and black, and also red, white, and black, depending on what style of glass it was. Unfortunately, we would find that they broke very easily and couldn't be used. I also chose a diner-style type of flatware called rolled buffalo. It was not bright white. For example, the plates had a rolled edge, hence the name. Most of our plates, bowls, mugs, cappuccino cups, teacups, teapots, salt and pepper shakers, and sweetener holders were branded with a certain style Indian script in black. I added a baseball tail that stretched from the end all the way across under the Indian script. Below that, in very small type and all caps, read, "Since 1901. This was another cool element of the modern vintage vibe. We even had our own bottled Indian motorcycle, chipotle, jalapeno, and habanero pepper sauces in the center of every table. The sauces were also sold in the retail store. Above the shelves behind the bar was a backlit sign in which I could open the light box and place whatever image I wanted. I had my buddy Todd from Woolge's Team Printing make a Duratrans which is printed on a translucent film. I chose the image of a 1906 Indian motorcycle with flowers lying across a tank in front of a gorgeous backdrop which Todd had originally given me. On either side of the sign were pinned-off frosted glass backdrops with clear glass shelves, which would be great for display. Opposite the end of the bar, against the wall, was another ecru/cream colored display unit with a stainless steel-looking pinned-off Indian motorcycle logo placed above. This one had 24 recessed square shelves with the same ecru/colored plexiglass backing as the one in the lobby. However, when we turned it on, it was way too bright for the customers as they were dining, so we usually left it off. Nevertheless, it was excellent for displaying our wines. Separating the bar from the dining room was a maple patrician with a black lacquered wooden drink rail on the bar side, with the same black lacquered high-back wooden stools. The top of the maple patrician was capped with a black lacquered top slightly larger than the wall. On the top, spaced evenly apart, were glass panels with the etched double circle Indian headdress logo. On either side facing the dining room was a long leather banquette with Indian motorcycle dome buttons like the one in the lobby. The tables had wooden maple bottoms and legs and black lacquered tabletops with recessed Indian motorcycle plaques in diagonally opposite corners. There were 2 4x8 frosted glass panels with double circle Indian headdress logos etched clear, which were spaced 10 inches apart and were supported by 2-inch by 2-inch stainless steel posts from floor to ceiling. They were off to the right, and it separated the dining room nicely. It was great for large reservations and gave the area some privacy. Against the west wall was another ecru/cream colored display unit, except this one had 36 recessed square shelves in which we displayed our wine selections. On the south wall, there were large windows which had black California shutters. I couldn't go with the curtains 2x4 had suggested with little motorcycles on them. I thought they'd look too much like pajamas. Separating the windows were 3 walls that had 6-foot by 4-foot maple backdrops with Indian motorcycle pinned-off logos. In front were beautiful large black lacquered stainless steel glass display cases. An assortment of Indian motorcycle memorabilia was in each one. To the far left, beside the kitchen door, were 2 more large frosted glass panels with the double-circled Indian headdress logo, etched clear to protect the diners from the waitstaff coming and going. The kitchen had an open look, with just a touch of Art Deco. There was a 12-foot frosted glass 2-piece facade which came down from the top of the kitchen opening. Each piece had a double-circle Indian headdress logo etched clear, facing each other. At my request, diners could see inside the kitchen to where there was a pizza oven. Originally, I wanted a wood-burning oven. However, I settled for a gas-fired. It was an Italian-made, and the pizzas were delicious. The look added to the ambiance. Throughout the kitchen, we had all the essential equipment, but downstairs were extra items that would really come in handy. There was a sanitized section with ozonized water and sink to clean and disinfect vegetables. There was a walk-in freezer and a walk-in fridge for dry products. We had 2 storage rooms, a 3-compartment sink, and a full prep kitchen with a convection oven. We were well equipped to throw any size party. In front of the kitchen in the dining room was a maple veneered bread cutting unit. Behind was a counter where the waitstaff could slice bread, and below were shelves which held various items. In front were two more large frosted glass panels with a double-circled Indian headdress logo etched clear, spaced a foot and a half apart. There were two pillars in the dining room that were painted charcoal and encased in maple. At the bottom of each pillar was a 4-foot black lacquered frame, and 5.5 feet above, capping the maple, were black lacquered cornice moldings. On the charcoal pillar, a foot and a half above on all four sides, were these aluminum sconces that had an Art Deco look and shone upwards. I was at my buddy Alex's shop, Systemilux, a great lighting supplier of mine, and saw these interesting fixtures in the back room. I said, "What the fuck are those?" "Fuss, those are samples. We're just testing," he replied. I loved them and asked, "Can I get 8 of them, man?" They really added to the overall ambience of the room. The washrooms were down a hallway on the way to the patio, which we referred to as the garage. They had maple doors, pastel mosaic tile walls, and granite countertops, with mirrors that had a small engraved double-circled Indian headdress logo at the top. They followed the same modern vintage look. On the wall, opposite the bathrooms, was a black lacquered drink rail. I decided that I wanted a glass display just above it, inset into the wall, with sliding glass windows, in a black lacquered frame that I could open and lock. This was to display some of the Indian motorcycle news magazines and others I had collected and could periodically change the display easily. It was about 15 feet high, and I had the black velvet as the backdrop, with the items spaced a few inches apart. This added to the museum-like feel. It was a great idea, and I decided I would do it wherever there was a bare wall above a drink rail. Furthermore, just ahead from there were 2 glass doors that led to the patio, with etched double-circled Indian headdress logos facing each other, inset in a totally glass mullion wall. Along the glass panels at eye level, I applied frosted vinyl, double-circled Indian headdress logos, to look as though they were etched into the windows and could be visible from inside and out. On the left was the door that led to the foyer of the building's entrance and was where any handicapped customer could enter. Inside the patio on the east wall, there was a huge neon Indian motorcycle dealer sign with Indian script in red neon and motorcycle in pale green neon. It was set on a red/black box, which was half of the original dealer sign. It was perfect for the room and was why we also called the patio the garage. The lettering on the outside of the building reinforced the name where it read Sales and Service. Below the sign, I hung 3 pictures in black frames to match the lacquered drink rail below. The south wall was divided into 2 sections. The east had large mullion windows to look like the garage door on the other side of the encased beam, with a radiator in front. It had a maple box cover with a stainless steel piece mounted in front, like the first floor bar. There was a smaller sized piece cut out of the box so the heat from the radiator could be released but wasn't visible. The box cover was capped with the black lacquered top, which matched the drink rails. Beside that was the rectangular garage door, which would eventually lead to the outdoor patio. On the opposite wall of the neon sign was a huge 7-foot high by 6-foot wide painting that was mounted to the wall and had a black distressed thick wood frame. My buddy the Daler painted it for me. It was a copy of a cover of a 1916 Indian motorcycle brochure I had collected. In the background was a scene of people leaving work, and in the foreground it was a guy on an Indian motorcycle waving. The tagline was "So long till Monday." I had a great two-sided perpendicular metal Indian motorcycle dealer sign and mounted it on one of the walls that encased the two glassed entrance doors. I had purchased both signs from my buddy in Colorado, Jeff Grigsby. This area could hold private parties and dinners of 18 to 22 people. Sometimes we'd use dinner tables and push them together to create one long table setting. It was most beautiful when set up like that. I also picked a really cool ecru cream molded plastic freestanding light fixture that was 5.5 feet tall and 9 inches wide in the middle, tapering to 3 inches at the top and bottom. It had 4 sections, which were connected with little hooks to allow a 1/4-inch space between them. It resembled a vintage toy rocket ship and sat on 4 fin-like feet. The only drawback was when people periodically dislodged the little hooks, I'd either find them still in one of the holes or on the floor. Despite this minor design flaw, we'd use this light throughout the 3 floors of the cafe. I was actually working well with the con man at this point. He was dealing with the contractor for Milcom Construction, who oversaw the interior build-out of the entire place, including Pinehurst Woodworking Co., who manufactured all the millwork. 2x4 Design had suggested we do a circular staircase covered with velvet curtains to access the 2nd floor. There was no way I was doing that. Instead, we had an open staircase concept with 8 to 10 wood steps to the landing with no risers to allow you to see through. Another 8 steps followed this to the 2nd floor. It had 2-inch by 2-inch stainless steel railings, posts, and brackets, which held the smaller glass panels in place. This gave it the effect that the glass was floating. As I had requested the use of the Indian motorcycle front fender lights, they were placed on stainless steel mounts and were then welded to the posts on the inside to give off just the right amount of light to add to the ambience. Consequently, underneath the landing on the 1st floor became a great spot to display a motorcycle. I would eventually use stainless steel posts and heavy chains to dissuade idiots from trying to sit on the bike. Entering the 2nd floor, the first thing you'd see was a stage to the right. It was 2 feet high and covered in charcoal carpet. There was a charcoal wall at the back of the stage, and I mounted 3 big black and white front fender images. I used this image a lot as it was synonymous with the brand. In front of that, suspended from the ceiling, was a screen that could be pulled down for projected presentations. The con man had used Westbury sound systems to do all the sound and lighting for all 3 floors. To the left was the DJ booth, which had a 4-inch black lacquered ledge with 6-inch high protective frosted glass panels in the front and the side facing the stage. The booth had a door that could be locked, as all the CDs as well as sound and lighting equipment in there was very valuable. It had 3 steps as it was elevated, allowing the DJ an overview of the dance floor and stage. If you continued straight, heading north, on your right there was a wall with a black lacquered drink rail. I inset the same window display above it as I had done downstairs, with more vintage motorcycle magazines. It was very long, so we could set bar stools in front on an angle. Below was a long footrail, just like the short ones at the 1st floor bar. Across was a movable 5-foot-high maple wall with a black lacquered cap and had 3 clear glass panels with etched double-circled Indian headdress logos, much like the one across from the 1st floor bar. It was designed by 2x4 to be in front of the washrooms. Luckily, we were able to slide it over, and it was a perfect separation wall to keep the dance floor in front of the DJ booth protected and give it some privacy. Along the west wall of the dance floor, in front of the radiators below the windows, and also the north wall below the windows, were stainless steel drink stands. They had the etched double-circled Indian headdress logo framed with heavy bolts on the face below the 5-inch ledge. In front, there were stainless steel foot rails with rubber inserts. They looked amazing and were a great way to cover up the radiators. The most ironic thing, which I only realized after we opened, was all the drinks that people would put on the ledge would just fall behind and break. I thought to myself, holy shit, another 2x4 drink rail that looks great but doesn't function properly. I fixed that by designing a stainless steel railing 2.5 inches high that surrounded the sides and back. It looked great and it worked. All the windows on the second floor had beige bronze drapes. We tied them 3/4 of the way down, creating a nice graceful folds on both sides for the window treatment. Between the windows were black veneered backdrops with pinned off stainless steel Indian motorcycle logos, like the maple ones in the dining room. Below were maple mounts to hold 14 pool cues. In front of them were four 4-foot by 8-foot pool tables covered in red felt. I wanted something completely unique to hang above the tables. Thus, I went to Systemilux, looking for something special. I was in the back room looking around, as I knew they always kept samples in there. Sure enough, I see these aluminum pieces that resembled the shape of a barracuda. They also were very rough, like the sconces I'd found for the dining room pillars. I asked Alex, what are these, man? They're just samples, Fuss. Alexio, can these be suspended above the pool tables? If they can, I need 4, please. He was always very accommodating. They hung by 2 thin wires and were a little finicky as they were only samples. That's how we got the funkiest pool table lights I've ever seen. Opposite the pool tables was a wall with a black lacquer drink rail and a stainless steel rubber foot rail. Above it was the same glass display case, also featuring vintage motorcycle magazines from my collection. At the end of the pool tables on the east wall was the unsightly HVAC system, which hung from the ceiling. I decided to box it in and painted ecru/cream to match the walls. There were doors in the front to get access to the unit, and they were framed in black. Below the encased unit, there was a space 5 feet high. Using my creativity and desire to maximize the space, I decided to box it in with a huge front window, which was also framed in black to match. On the right side, there were 2 doors that opened out so I could bend down a bit and roll a motorcycle, creating a great display area. I would change it frequently as it was a very popular display, since the pool tables were always being used. Turning south, and on the right, there was another glass display above the drink rail to match the displays on the other 2 adjoining walls. Across were the washrooms that had maple doors with thick stainless steel symbols depicting the gender on the inside. The treatments were the same as downstairs, although a frosted glass wall with an engraved double-circle Indian headdress logo separated the men and women's washrooms. There was a space at the top and bottom. This unique treatment caused quite a stir, as you could imagine. In between the washrooms, the display wall was where 2x4 wanted to put the separation wall, which would have made the area much too narrow on both sides. South of the display wall, behind the stage, there was a room where all the power supply for the sound and stage lighting was housed. There was also room for some storage, and we'd eventually keep a Hammond B3 organ in there. Looking down the east wall was a bar, basically like the first floor, but much longer. In the middle of the bar was another backlit light box, which was much larger than the one downstairs. Naturally, the Duratrans image I used was the old Red Indian chief in the middle of a field. I placed the translucent acetate image in the box and just stood there, as I had never seen it so big and bright. I never would have thought all those years ago, when I had first seen the ad in a magazine, that it would mean so much to me. On both sides were maple backdrop shelving units. There were 3 small alcoves which had lighting behind and created a cool effect when the thick glass shelves were inserted. The top shelf was very high, so we displayed one of the beautiful Galois Indian motorcycle models on each side of the backlit image. Below were glasses and certain liquors and liqueurs, and below that in the middle were maple cabinets with a black lacquered top, where bottles that were readily poured sat for quick access. Between the draped windows along the south wall, there were backdrops just like downstairs, except instead of maple veneered, these were black veneered. In front of the 2 middle ones, there were display cases with memorabilia. Beside the sections that were against the walls were the ecru cream molded plastic freestanding light fixtures. They were the same as I had used in the garage patio. In the farthest southwest corner, in front of the 2 sections, there was a hanging fireplace, which was visible from both sides and was encased in stainless steel. This was magnificent for the atmosphere created and gave the 2 couch and chair sections privacy. James Jimmy Ward and I had created several versions of the Indian Chief chair and couch. As previously mentioned, the piping was in contrast to the color of the piece, which was either black or butterscotch. The back cushion was attached by a piece of leather, and the seat cushion had contrasting piping curved downward on the front to match the sides of the arms. We started off with sections of couches and chairs in both colors, and it was always couches against the walls unless it was in the middle of the room and there were no walls. In that situation, we'd have 2 couches and a chair at each end. In the middle of each section, we had a black lacquered tabletop with maple bottoms and legs with recessed plaques. All of them sat on a carpet/rug with 4 red and black squares diagonally opposite. We encased the bottom of the pillars in maple, the same as we had done on the first floor, but they were only 3.5 feet high and had electrical outlets on all sides. At night, we'd remove the sections in front of the stage to create a second dance floor. The freight elevator was very convenient for that, as we'd just move everything to the 3rd floor. And if that was busy, there was a boxed-in staircase leading to the 3rd floor as well. On the 3rd floor, I hung the black and white posters throughout, much like we had at 60 Wingold Avenue. All the windows had black California shutters, and the pillars were encased in maple, much like the 2nd floor, and the only difference was they were surrounded with 9 black lacquered drink rails. We had taken the 7-foot pool table and placed it in the southwest corner alcove. Beside the window on the west wall was a rack for the pool cues. Against the wall beside it was a leather cushioned banquette with the domed Indian motorcycle buttons. It sat on a maple base with stainless steel legs with no sidearms and was much shorter than the one in the lobby. Along the south wall, in front of the pool table, were a couple leather sections on the black-red squared carpet rugs, and beside them were the plastic molded freestanding lights. Somehow we had an extra display unit, just like the one in the lobby on the 1st floor. 2x4 must have wanted it somewhere that I thought wouldn't be appropriate, and I decided to position it just north of the freight elevator and the staff stairwell. There was an area of wall space facing north, and it fit perfectly. Beside it was an alcove where we displayed a bike. We didn't plug it in, but displayed items in the 12 encased shelves that were appropriate for whatever event was being held there at the time. The highlight of this floor was the boardroom, which took up a quarter of the room along the north wall. It had 2 large maple doors on either side of the boxed-in elevator and stairwells that you could enter from. Murray had suggested we have a huge boardroom table. something that would be unique. I worked with the millwork guys and came up with a 36-foot maple veneered tabletop with a black 5-inch black sloped edge, which tapered at both ends so it resembled the wing of an airplane. Inlaid in the middle, in black, was a double-circled Indian headdress logo. 3 black circular metal bases 30 inches high supported it. The table was so long it had to be in 3 sections. I selected high-back executive leather chairs and had the Indian motorcycle dome buttons put on the top of the back section. I think it seated 30, and it was definitely monumental. Furthermore, the boardroom was state-of-the-art as it was fully equipped with an audio-visual system and a wireless internet access. There was also a leather section at the west end, which was behind the PowerPoint pull-down screen. Along the northern windowed wall were 2 glass display cases, like the ones on the first and second floors, containing memorabilia. On the north wall were cabinets which housed a stereo sound system and shelving which held flatware and glassware. It was cutting it close, but the boardroom was fully completed a few months after we opened. I would eventually develop this entire floor. Chapter 149. On the 4th floor, as you step out of the elevator, we had a very impressive maple veneered reception desk with a curved front and was 10 feet wide by 4 feet high. On either side of the black California shuttered windows, behind the reception desk, were columns painted charcoal and had shiny gray sconces that were actually for outdoors. Nevertheless, I picked them because they resembled the Indian motorcycle headlight. To the right, we displayed 2 new motorcycles, and beside that were 2 Indian motorcycle chief chairs with an Indian motorcycle lounge table on a red-black carpet rug. We built executive offices along the west and south wall. My office was in the southeast corner and was the largest, as I needed space for my desk as well as my drafting table. Along the east wall was a series of offices, the kitchen, and the washrooms. I made sure the men's was equipped with a very cool shower that you might find in your home. It was tiled and had a clear, thick glass door with the etched double circle Indian headdress logo, of course. In the middle area, we had high-tech cubicles installed. This space could be used for either expansion or to rent. All in all, the development of the cafe was a real labor of love, but I was tremendously satisfied with how it turned out and enjoyed the process of creating it from scratch. It was definitely one of my proudest achievements. Chapter 150. At 60 Wingold Avenue, I was having arguments with Murray about how the Sly Man was still making samples that did not fit the image of the brand. This was no surprise to me, and I said to Murray, "Did you see those fucking boring pieces in the showroom? Like that old man sleeveless V-neck sweater?" To which he responded with, "What do you mean? I like that sweater, and I'm the epitome of an Indian motorcycle customer." "Murray, when you came here, you were wearing pleated pants and an old man shawl-collared sweater," I quipped back. Even though I wasn't happy about the situation, I didn't let it stop me from creating products for the latest collection. When the line was completed, I went through it with Murray and removed the pieces that I didn't feel fit the brand. On an unrelated note, my friend Mike Tipsh Topovich was sadly confined to a wheelchair. Having the Indian motorcycle Winnebago at my disposal allowed me to be able to pick him up and his wife up, along with a few friends, and take them for a tour of the cafe before it opened. Not only did I get to show him what I had designed and created, but also he didn't let being in a wheelchair stop him from playing some pool. That was the Mike that I knew. Sadly, he passed away on December 26, 1998, less than a month before we opened. It meant so much to me to be able to have done that and given him that experience, and it was one of my fondest memories. Chapter 151. I was working on the menu with the chef that the con man hired, who was a friend of his from Montreal. I always wanted to have a restaurant, so I was going to watch over it to a certain degree and make sure I had a few of my favorite items on the menu. Having the pizza oven was great, but I needed to make sure we could make an amazing finished product. After extensive testing, I realized that the first key was getting the proper dough for the crusts. The second was making the right sauce. As long as you used fresh ingredients and knew what went well together to create interesting combinations. Here were a few of my signature creations. The Fussy Club sandwich with Granny Smith apple. I had first experienced the green apple in a club sandwich at a restaurant called Fiesta, which was owned by the same owners as Fresh before it became RPM. Fussy wings, Louisiana style. As you know, I wanted to open a wing concept, which is why these had to be up to my standards. I personally took the chef to a place called the Bistro on Avenue, which was the precursor to St. Louis and was owned by one of the partners from Chicken Deli. We realized that the wings had to be marinated and baked first. The result was amazing. Fussy oven roasted half chicken. This was just good old roasted chicken with great sides. Our menu consisted of contemporary cuisine, from masterfully prepared dishes to feel-good favorites. I had a mock-up of the menu for the cafe when Murray walked into my office. He was going over the prices and said, "These prices are very expensive, Fuss." "Murray, I'm sure the chef has done his due diligence in this area," I replied. I thought no more of it. It was then that he came up with the most ridiculous idea and said, "We should have 1901 prices." This was because Indian Motorcycle had started in 1901. I said, "Murray, we're not doing that. Our clientele will have no problem with these prices. We are not selling a burger and fries for 5 cents. That was Murray being Murray. He was brilliant in certain areas, but also completely absurd in others. As an example, he came down to the cafe after completion and walked by the kitchen and said, "Oh, we definitely have to rip out the kitchen. It looks terrible." This was laughable, as the Indian Motorcycle Cafe and Lounge won the Best Design Award for 2x4, including the terrible kitchen. Chapter 152. When I was heading out to see live music at my favorite spots on College Street, I was now spreading the word and recruiting bands, getting them excited about the great venue where they would soon be performing. Bands like Soul Stew, LMT Connection, Pepper Seed, Volume 1. I was still going to see Raptors, who looked promising at the time. With Vince Carter, Tracy McGrady, and Charles Oakley, I always look forward to taking my father and friends to games, and I always saw hoopers I'd played with. I was still hooping with Ted and the boys and couldn't wait to take them to the cafe when it opened. The Green Man was still doing very well with the Indian Motorcycle clothing line. He had also opened a retail store in Vancouver. I knew Dave Lauer, who was the manager in TO before he moved to Vancouver to run that location. When he'd come to Toronto, I'd get the reports on how great it was doing and also how much people loved Indian Motorcycle out there. Meanwhile, things were crazy with excitement of which company would be awarded the Indian Motorcycle trademark for the world, excluding Canada, as we already own that. However, many deals were being made in the U.S. Up until this moment, Rick Block of Sterling Corporation was in charge of the receivership, and that's all that mattered. Whoever claimed they had rights in the U.S. would all be part of the receivership and be sold to one owner. Ultimately, That turned out to be Eller Industries. We were bummed. Murray said to me, well, we can still make the bike in Canada, but it won't be the same. He never gave up and kept on thinking of ways to get the U.S. trademark. Eller Industries hired Roche Industries to design the engine for the motorcycle, and were negotiating with the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua tribe of Indians to build a motorcycle factory on their tribal land. 3 renderings were designed. Suspension designer James Parker specified 1 each of a cruiser, a sport cruiser, and a sport bike, and the frames. Eller Industries arranged a public unveiling of the cruiser prototype for 1998 of November, but was prevented from showing the prototype by a restraining order from the Seaver, who said that Eller had failed to meet the terms of its obligations. The contract was withdrawn after the company missed its deadline to close the deal and could not agree with the receiver to an extension on the deadline. Other conditions, including payment of administrative costs and presenting a working prototype, were also not met. Chapter 153. During this time, Murray had been corresponding with Rick Block and presented him with our working prototype, along with plans of a merger of 9 companies, including CMC in Gilroy, California. Based on this, we were awarded the Indian Motorcycle trademark by the Federal District Court of Colorado on December 7th, 1998. We were ecstatic. It was unbelievable. Murray had never given up, and Eller Industries fucked up. As a result, we own the global trademark, so essentially we own the world. Not only that, for a short time, believe it or not, I was the largest shareholder of Indian Motorcycle. I couldn't believe it. The company was then restructured and everything was transferred into the U.S. company, and I became a much smaller piece of a much bigger pie. J.L. Albright Venture Partners led the corporate financing and the mergers and acquisition team. He would collaborate with Mike Weckerly, who was known as a rock star in the world of Canadian finance. We'd become friends, and I would refer to him simply as Weck. At this point, knowing that Wing's son Garments was out of the picture, I could only hope that Jack didn't lose any money. Chapter 154. At one point during this time, I was attending a party for Revolver Films. As I mentioned previously, I knew Don Allen and loved his parties. It was a fantastic scene, and I met a girl from Winnipeg who had just moved to Toronto. Her name was Hazel May Davila, and she was very cool and in very good shape. She told me that in Winnipeg, she'd been head of the Budweiser product promo girls. I said, how come you're so ripped? She had very muscular arms and told me that she worked out with professional bodybuilders. I was having a great time and invited her to the opening party for the cafe, which she came to, and we started seeing each other shortly thereafter. We didn't get serious, but I saw her on and off for a bit, and we became great friends. She always kept telling me that she could play hoops, and finally I couldn't take it anymore and had to see if this was true. I knew some guys who had a game going at Mackenzie Collegiate, so I took her. They said it was cool if we shot around on the side. Sure enough, Davila could play. We each took 10 foul shots, and she shot 8 for 10. Aside from her hooping skills, she also worked in real estate, accounting, and did charity work. We remain great friends to this day.